Sansa Stark stood upon the windy heights of the Eyrie, cloak flapping fiercely around her, gazing at the dizzying drop beneath her feet. It was midday, but the sun seemed cold and distant in the Vale, and the air was thin enough that each breath felt like a small victory. She had grown accustomed to the altitude, but never to the anxiety that came with being so high above the world. In the distant valley, the rolling green hills were half covered in swirling mists, as if the land itself tried to hide from the stone wings of the Eyrie above. She was no longer Elaine Stone, the sweet bastard daughter of Petyr Baelish. No, though she did not announce it to the world, though she had not spoken it aloud to anyone, in her heart she was Sansa Stark again, a daughter of the North, heir to the name Stark if not the land, and she had grown tired of hiding, tired of the game, tired of watching Littlefinger dole out slivers of truth while guarding his many secrets like a miser with his coins. The wind brought the distant cry of a falcon from below, where the castle's eyrie housed the birds that hunted the Vale's many crags. Sansa's red-brown hair whipped across her face, tangling against her cheeks, and she brushed it aside as she turned to look over her shoulder. Petyr Baelish, Littlefinger, stood not far away, watchful as ever, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. He wore his sly half-smile, and there was a triumphant flicker in his gaze. Ever since they had come here, and Lady Lisa Arryn had met her end, Petyr had worked diligently to secure the Vale's loyalty. He managed to quiet suspicions about Lisa's death, to stroke the pride of the Vale lords, to keep them complacent and uncertain as to who truly wielded power. He had nearly succeeded. Sansa had played her role, a perfect, delicate creature whose lineage was uncertain, whose claim to anything was tenuous at best. She had found small ways to resist him, little moments of defiance, but always hidden behind wide eyes and trembling lips. She was a master now of feigned innocence, a skill that sometimes made her despise herself. But she was still just as trapped as ever, still reliant on Littlefinger's machinations to keep her safe from Cersei Lannister and from the horrors of the war-torn realm. And yet, she felt something shift in her heart with each passing day. Perhaps it was the memory of her parents, how they had died. Perhaps it was the memory of Lady Catelyn's fierce love, a love that Sansa now tried to summon within herself, not just for her siblings, wherever they might be, but for her own survival. Or perhaps it was the ghost of her own father, reminding her of the cost of naivete, of too much trust in cunning men. She would never again be such a pawn. A hush came over her thoughts when she heard Petyr's footsteps approach. She turned slowly, schooling her features into a subdued, thoughtful expression. "It's a fine view, isn't it?" he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "Do you remember the first time we arrived here together?" "Yes," she answered, her voice soft. "I do." She did not elaborate further. In the beginning, her heart had pounded with anxiety in this place, next to him, but she had learned to disguise her fear. She had learned to keep her thoughts to herself. He moved closer, leaning on the stone parapet near her, so that they both looked out at the Vale in something akin to companionship. On the surface, they might have appeared a father and daughter enjoying the breeze, reflecting on the world below. But the tension in Sansa's shoulders never left her. She knew that one wrong slip, one ill-timed question, could spark Littlefinger's deadly suspicion. There was a light in his gray-green eyes. "I have good news," he said quietly, though there was not a soul within earshot. "The Lords Declarant grow more amenable to our cause. Soon enough the Vale will march, and they will not question me, or you, my dear Elaine." Her gaze flickered briefly to his face. "Then your plan will come to fruition," she said, letting only a little excitement into her voice. "All your careful work, all for the sake of the realm, as you say?" There was a slightly teasing edge to her tone, and she hoped he did not notice. He did not appear offended. Instead, he gave her that famous sly grin, the one that turned his face fox-like. "All that is done for a reason, sweetling." He paused, then reached out and brushed back a stray lock of her hair. "We must keep you safe. You are precious, far more precious than you realize." She felt that familiar shiver of unease whenever he touched her, but she allowed it, raising her eyes to meet his. She caught a whiff of his perfume, some concoction of myrrh and something sharper, the subtle scent he always seemed to carry. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping back and dipping her head. "I trust you." He smiled again, a small, satisfied expression, and turned away to survey the Vale once more. "We should go," he said. "Young Robert will have his lessons soon, and you know how he grows distressed without you." The last words were teasing, but also pointed. Petyr seemed to delight in how sweet Robin clung to Sansa, how the boy insisted on her presence for his every meal, his every sleep. That was but another layer of the net Petyr spun, and Sansa was expected to be a comforting figure, a sisterly presence to subdue the child's flighty moods. Sansa watched him with a measured calm. "Yes, let us go," she said, and they departed from the windy heights. But before she stepped through the doorway, she stole one last glance out across the Vale, across the piercing horizon. A tremor coursed through her chest, half fear, half fervent resolve. The day of meek acceptance was nearing its end. She followed Littlefinger down the high hallway of the Eyrie, the sound of their footsteps echoing faintly on the cold floors. The corridors were bright, with narrow windows designed to let in sunlight even this high, but the stone was unforgiving. Despite the tapestries and the braziers, a chill always permeated the Eyrie's halls. Sansa was used to it, but it felt all the more biting today. They crossed through an arched passageway that led to the main solar, where Robert Arryn, the Lord of the Eyrie, was perched on a cushioned seat. He was pale and thin, wide-eyed like a frightened bird, though he had grown a little taller since their arrival months before. His hair was limp, his complexion sallow, and there was a perpetual tremor in his limbs that Sansa could not ignore. Although he was older than he had been when she first arrived in King's Landing, he remained childlike in so many ways. He clapped his small hands when Sansa came into view, a gesture that made the maester standing beside him raise an exasperated eyebrow. "Elaine, Elaine," Robert called out. "Come, sit by me. The maester was telling me stories of the Knights of the Vale, but I want you to hear them, too." Sansa offered a warm, indulgent smile. "Of course, my lord," she said in her gentle tone, moving to take a seat near him. Petyr lingered in the background, observing. She could feel his gaze on her, the watchfulness, as if analyzing how she might soothe the child. "You're so pale, my lord," she said softly, brushing a hand over Robert's clammy forehead. "Are you feeling unwell today?" He blinked a few times, then looked down at his own hands, which still trembled slightly. "I had a fit this morning," he mumbled, pouting. "But it passed quickly." Sansa nodded sympathetically. "I'm glad you are feeling better now." The maester cleared his throat, adjusting the chain around his neck. "Shall I continue, my lord?" His voice was steady but carried a hint of displeasure. "I was describing the heroic deeds of Lord Arryn in Robert's rebellion, that he once—" "Ugh!" Robert interrupted with a petulant sigh. "I'm tired of that story. Don't we have anything new?" Sansa reached out to gently pat his arm. "My lord, history is a tapestry, every thread leading to the present. It might seem tedious, but you are the Lord of the Eyrie. One day, you will need to know these tales, to inspire your knights and keep them loyal to you." Robert looked away, sulking. "I wish none of this had ever happened," he mumbled. "I miss my mother." Sansa's smile tightened at the corners. Lisa Arryn's final moments at the moon door flashed through her mind, along with the memory of Littlefinger's push. She swallowed hard, though her expression did not waver. "I know, my lord, but you must be strong, for her sake." He nodded dully, and the maester carefully cleared his throat again. "Then, perhaps, my lord, you would prefer a less weighty tale for the afternoon?" With an impatient wave of his hand, Robert nodded. Yes, something that doesn't have to do with war." The maester gave Sansa a glance before beginning a new story, this time about the founding of the Vale by the first men, a gentler myth involving love and devotion rather than bloodshed. Robert settled into his cushions, lulled by the smooth baritone of the maester's voice. Sansa felt the boy relax, and when she was certain his mind was occupied, she risked a flicker of a glance at Petyr. She saw that cunning gleam again. He offered her a small nod, as if to commend her. She averted her eyes, keeping her face composed. Though she had begun to formulate the seeds of her rebellion, she needed him to believe that she was his dutiful, grateful protégé. She would play that role for as long as it served her. When the maester finished, Robert was nearly dozing. Sansa stood gracefully, mindful of the rustle of her skirts. She smoothed them down and moved away from the boy, letting the maester tend to him. Petyr intercepted her before she left the chamber, and together they strolled into the adjoining corridor. She felt the tension coil in her belly, but her outward demeanor was calm. "You're tired," Petyr said, feigning concern, "though you hide it well." She forced a small laugh, as if amused that he noticed. "It's the altitude, I suppose. I do not sleep as well here as I once did at home." She could hardly remember Winterfell's warm halls, the sense of security she once took for granted. Perhaps that was a lie, for Winterfell was not always warm. The north was always cold, but it had been warm in her heart. His face softened, or pretended to. "You do so well. Soon we'll have no more need of these pretenses. I promise you that." When he mentioned promises, she felt the slightest stirring of anger in her chest, but she contained it. "I trust you, Petyr," she answered, lowering her eyes demurely. And in truth, she did not entirely doubt him. She believed he would do whatever it took for his own advantage, which currently meant protecting her. But how long until that advantage shifted? How long until she was a loose end, better cut away than kept alive? They parted ways, and she slipped into the small chamber that had become hers. Once a modest room for lesser nobles visiting the Eyrie, now her personal retreat. She latched the door, exhaling as if she had been holding her breath for days. She let her head rest against the wood for a moment, eyes closed, her heart pounding. "You must move carefully," she told herself. It had taken her many weeks to piece together a plan. She had no illusions about besting Petyr Baelish outright by wit alone. He was too clever, too experienced in manipulation. But he had grown overconfident, trusting in his control of her, his belief that she had no other option but to rely on him. That, Sansa realized, was his weakness. She crossed to the small writing desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a sheet of parchment and an inkwell. Slowly, she dipped the quill, glancing toward the closed door to ensure she was alone. Then, with a steady hand, she began to write. "To the lords of the Vale, humbly do I, Sansa Stark, beg an audience. I come before you, a daughter of Eddard Stark of Winterfell, betrothed once to King Joffrey Baratheon, captured by the Lannisters, wed to Tyrion, and now held beneath the watch of Petyr Baelish. I swear upon the old gods and the new that I intend no treachery, only freedom for myself and for the Vale. I request a private meeting with any among you who remember the loyalty between the Vale and the North. My father fought beside your men, and though tragedy has befallen my house, I stand before you to ask for your aid. We have all been pawns in Lord Baelish's game. Together, we can reforge an alliance that will see the Vale rise with honor, not subterfuge. I humbly await your reply. Should you be willing to lend your ears, send word by falcon. I am ready." She set down the quill, her hand trembling slightly at what she had just committed to parchment. If Petyr found this, if he even suspected what she was doing, she would be finished. More than finished. Likely discarded from the moon door, just as Aunt Lisa had been. But Sansa felt a blaze in her that she recognized as courage. It had been so long since she'd felt such a thing, a stirring of real agency. She spent long minutes checking the letter, ensuring it was phrased in a way that might appeal to any Vale lord who still held some measure of honor, or who might resent Petyr's ambitions. Finally, she folded it carefully, tying it with a thin strip of ribbon, and she rose to hide it in a secret place she had found behind the hearthstone. She would send it that night, smuggled out by a single falconer who had shown her kindness. She hoped that kindness might extend to secrecy, if properly bribed. Though her coin was scant, she had some bits of jewelry left that Petyr had gifted her to maintain appearances. She would use what she must. She had to be cautious, for Petyr's spies were everywhere. But as cunning as Petyr was, he could not read her mind. He only saw what she chose to show him. Late that night, when the corridors were silent, and she was certain Littlefinger had retired, she slipped from her chamber. The Eyrie servants were few and lightly staffed at this hour. Only a handful of guards stood watch, more concerned with external threats than the internal movements of a young lady they believed loyal to Lord Baelish. Sansa kept her steps light, heart pounding in her throat. She kept her hood drawn low, her cloak wrapped tight. She had arranged to meet the falconer at the mews in the upper courtyard, near the swirling columns that led to the towers. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows on the pale stone walls. The falconer, a lanky youth with a hawk-like face, stood waiting. He bobbed his head in greeting when he saw her. "Mistress Elaine," he said, using her public name with a respectful hush. "Thank you for meeting me," she whispered, pressing a small pouch of coins and a silver ring into his hand. "I have a letter that must reach one of the Lords Declarant in secret, and quickly." She pulled out the folded parchment from within her cloak. "I beg you, do this for me. You shall be well rewarded." The falconer hesitated, glancing around, his eyes a bit wide. "My lady, if Lord Petyr learns of this." She nodded gravely. "I know, he must not. But if you are discreet, if you say nothing, I promise more rewards will follow once the letter finds its recipient." She did not mention the possibility that if Petyr discovered the falconer's part in the subterfuge, he would be a dead man. She did not need to. The youth undoubtedly knew it himself. After a tense moment, the falconer nodded. "Very well. I know a falcon that can fly in the night, trained to swift flight. I will send your letter, my lady." Sansa squeezed his hand gratefully. "Thank you. You have done a great service to House Stark." She slipped away, returning through the winding corridors, breath caught in her throat. Her nerves were so tight she thought she might faint before she reached her chamber. By the time she closed the door behind her, she felt lightheaded, her face damp with sweat. But she had done it. The first step had been taken. Now it was in the hands of the Seven, the old gods, or any gods that might still care for her fate. Days passed. Each dawn found Sansa glancing at the distant sky, wondering if a falcon might return with a sealed reply. Each day, she rose, dressed, and performed her duties, assisting Robert, listening to Petyr's gentle instructions, always mindful of that serpent's tongue. She tried to glean more from him, tried to see if he suspected anything, but he was as inscrutable as ever. At times, she thought she saw a quizzical glint in his eye, a slight hesitation in how he addressed her, but she had no proof. She could only wait and watch and hope that her letter reached a sympathetic ear. In the intervening nights, her dreams were restless. She dreamed she was falling from the moon door, down into the swirling mists, and as she fell, she saw Petyr's mocking face hovering above, telling her that she had never been anything but a pawn. She would wake, heart pounding, tears in her eyes, hating the helplessness that had become her constant companion. But then, after nearly a fortnight, a small falcon arrived. It came in the early morning light, at the time when the Eyrie was stirring, preparing breakfast. The servants barely paid attention to the birds that arrived. Messages came and went with some frequency, as Petyr corresponded with lords across the Vale. Sansa, however, recognized the falcon by the fleck of white above its right eye. She excused herself from Robert's side with a polite word and hurried to the mews, hoping not to be seen. The same falconer stood there, carefully untying the message from the bird's leg. He looked anxious, but his gaze lit on her, and she saw relief flash across his face. He beckoned her over, handing her the tiny roll of parchment. Without a word, she tucked it into her sleeve and hurried back to her chamber. She locked the door, letting out a shaking breath before she carefully opened the letter. It was written in a cramped, careful script, one she did not immediately recognize. "Lady Stark, I have received your missive. I will not commit my name to this response. Know only that you have at least one friend among the Lords Declarant, one who remembers Eddard Stark's honor. If you can promise us that you truly stand apart from Petyr Baelish's plots, that you intend to see the Vale guided by a rightful hand, then we will consider hearing you. But be warned, should this be a trick of Baelish, your fate will be sealed. If you are sincere, if you truly stand as Sansa Stark, we may yet free you from his grasp. Proof of your identity, or at least proof that you are not in league with him, will be required. We suggest you show yourself to the Vale Lords, in secret, away from the Eyrie, if you can contrive such a meeting. The letter ended abruptly, without a signature or seal, but it was enough to make Sansa's hands tremble. She read it again, absorbing the words. In secret, away from the Eyrie. How would she manage that? Petyr seldom let her out of his sight. Whenever he traveled to meet the Lord's declarant, he left her behind, safe in the Eyrie. If she wished to meet them, she would have to contrive a reason to leave under Petyr's nose, or else do so without his knowledge entirely. She paced her small chamber, thinking, measuring possibilities. After some minutes, she carefully burned the note in the small hearth, watching the parchment curl to black. No evidence could remain. Then she sat at her desk and tried to calm her breathing. She needed a reason, some request, perhaps from Robert or from the Vale itself. If Robert insisted on traveling with her. But that was unthinkable. The boy was too frail, and Petyr watched him like a hawk. She needed something else. The plan she arrived at required days of careful preparation. She began whispering in Robert's ear about the scenic roads below the Eyrie, about the fresh mountain air, the waterfalls. She painted a pretty picture, telling him how beneficial a brief journey might be for his constitution. At first, he resisted, whining that he hated to leave the safety of the Eyrie. But Sansa had grown skilled in coaxing him. She appealed to his vanity, implying that a strong lord would show himself to his people, letting them see him in all his finery. A lesser lord might remain hidden away. Gradually, Robert warmed to the idea, deciding that a short trip to a lower estate, one still under the Eyrie's domain, might entertain him. The child lord eventually carried the notion to Petyr, prattling on about how Elaine had told him it would do him good. Petyr looked bemused at first, glancing at Sansa with a questioning look that she answered only with a timid smile. He had not outright refused, which was a promising sign. Still, Petyr was no fool. He insisted on accompanying them, along with a small retinue of knights, to ensure Robert's safety. Sansa could not very well appear disappointed. She merely hoped that once they were in the Vale's foothills, away from the Eyrie's narrow corridors, an opportunity would arise for her to slip away. She would need help from any allies she might still have among the staff or the knights. That was the risk. If Petyr suspected anything amiss, she might never see freedom again. Days later, they set out. Sansa rode in a small litter beside Robert, who complained of queasiness on the winding mountain paths. Petyr rode ahead, flanked by men who wore the sigil of House Royce, though he had carefully cultivated their loyalty, or at least their acquiescence. Sansa peered out through the litter's thin curtains at the steep drop to one side, the jagged peaks that hemmed in the pass. She felt a knot in her stomach at the treacherous path, but she breathed in the bracing mountain air to steady herself. She thought of the letter she'd burned, in secret away from the Eyrie. Now was her moment. She only had one chance. If she could slip away from Petyr's watchful eyes, she might meet with the unnamed lord who had written to her. Of course, she had no surety that the meeting would go well. It might be a trap, or it might be a sincere overture from a Vale lord who wanted to dethrone Petyr. But she had to try. They made camp at a small castle nestled in the lower reaches, called Sky's End, an ancient stone keep that served as a midway point between the Eyrie and the more populous towns below. The air was warmer here, the snow-capped peaks overhead still formidable, but the biting chill was softened by spring breezes. Robert was put to bed early, weary from the journey. Petyr dined with the knights in the main hall. Sansa begged off, claiming a headache, which was hardly unusual given the strain of travel. Instead of retiring, however, she donned a dark cloak, pulled the hood low, and made her way to the stables. The night was quiet, the sky clear with a round moon shining overhead. She knew the watch schedule, had memorized the placements of the guards. The stable boy, a freckled youth, jumped when he saw her. "My lady!" he exclaimed in a hoarse whisper, nearly dropping his pitchfork. "Shoo!" Sansa pressed a finger to her lips, urging silence. She looked around. "I need a horse, quickly." He blinked. "A horse? But, my lady, does Lord Baelish?" She pinned him with a beseeching look, letting some of her genuine desperation show. "I beg you, do not tell him. I need only a short ride for a matter of great importance. If you would help me, I will be in your debt." The stable boy hesitated, glancing at the door. I don't know, my lady. I could lose my position." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small coin purse. It was not a fortune, but enough to make a difference to one so young. "Take this. I'll bring the horse back. Please." He swallowed. "Very well," he said, looking both frightened and determined. "I'll get you a gentle mare. If you go alone." "Yes," she said, heart racing. "I go alone." Sansa waited while he hurried to fetch a mare from one of the stalls, a light-footed brown creature with a calm disposition. She stroked the horse's neck in gratitude, murmuring soft words to keep it steady. She had ridden before, of course, but seldom in such secret circumstances. Carefully, she mounted, arranging her skirts to avoid tangles, and seized the reins. The stable boy gave her a pitiful look, as if he feared for her safety. "Gods be with you, my lady." She nodded once, then urged the mare into a slow walk, passing out of the stable into the crisp night air. Her heart pounded so loudly that every hoofbeat seemed an echo of her pulse. She guided the horse around the keep's outer wall, staying in the shadow of the ramparts where the moonlight did not fully reach. A single guard stood watch at the gate, leaning on his spear. Sansa's throat tightened. She could try to brazen through, claim she was on Lord Baelish's errand. But the guard might question her, delay her. She had no time for that. Instead, she opted for a secondary gate, a smaller one used by servants to fetch water from a nearby spring. She prayed it would be open or at least unbarred. Luck was with her. She found it unguarded, likely because no one expected trouble. She dismounted, carefully pulled on the iron ring, and the wooden door swung open with a creak. She led the horse through, wincing at every rustle. But no alarm was raised. Once outside, she pushed the door closed behind her, hoping no one would notice it slightly ajar. She mounted again, and only then did she realize her hands were shaking violently. She forced them steady and urged the mare into a faster walk. The keep's wall loomed behind her, and the winding trail ahead led downhill into a cluster of pine trees. The route was uncertain, lit only by moonlight, but she had a rough sense of where she was going. She had arranged through her letter to meet at a small clearing half a league from Sky's End, near an old statue of the mother that travelers sometimes prayed to. She only hoped her contact would be there, that she wasn't riding into danger. The path descended into darkness. Each snap of a twig under the mare's hooves made her wince, convinced that any moment Petyr's men would ride after her. But the night remained hushed. The forest canopy whispered, branches swaying gently. Now and then a distant owl hooted, or a rustle in the undergrowth reminded her that the Vale's wild creatures prowled after midnight. She tried to calm her racing thoughts. She thought of her mother, the last time she'd seen her alive. She thought of her father, the stoicism on his face when he told her stories of the old days, when the Vale and the North stood side by side. She would not fail them. She would not be a frightened child forever. She repeated the words in her mind like a prayer. "I am Sansa Stark. I am not a pawn." Soon, she spotted the faint outline of the statue, a rough-hewn figure with open arms, set upon a small stone pedestal. Ivy clung to its base, half obscuring the mother's face. A faint moonbeam illuminated her carved features. Sansa swallowed, dismounting with care. She led the mare to the edge of the clearing and tied the reins to a low branch. Her heart hammered. She waited, ears straining for any sign of approach. The clearing was still, the hush broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. Time seemed to stretch painfully. She wondered if she had been a fool, if no one would come, or if she might be ambushed at any second. Then she heard it. The sound of hooves on the trail, a slow, deliberate approach. She crouched behind the statue, peering into the shadows. A single rider emerged from the trees, clad in a cloak so dark that the figure seemed almost disembodied. The rider halted near the statue, scanning the clearing. Then, quietly, the rider spoke, voice low and muffled. "Lady Sansa Stark, are you here?" Sansa's breath caught. It was a woman's voice, surprisingly. She stood slowly, stepping out so the moonlight could reveal her. "I am Sansa Stark," she said, eyes riveted on the rider. The woman dismounted, pushing back her hood. Sansa recognized her. Anya Waynwood, a stern-faced lady whose hair was shot through with gray. Sansa had seen her once from a distance, when Petyr had assembled the Vale Lords. She had not expected Lady Waynwood to come in person. "My lady," Sansa whispered, trembling. "You." "Speak quietly," Lady Waynwood said. She glanced around. "I came alone because I trust no one, not after what we have seen of Lord Baelish's cunning. You say you are Sansa Stark. You look like your mother, but I have seen illusions before. By the Seven, I need more than resemblance. Tell me something only Sansa Stark could know." Sansa swallowed, her mind racing. "You once escorted Lady Catelyn and Lord Eddard from the Bloody Gate to the Eyrie, when I was very young. My father carried me on his shoulders part of the way, and you joked that if we were attacked by mountain clans, I would have a better view than anyone. I was no more than 4 years old, but I remember that your granddaughter teased me. My hair was in 2 braids, each tied with a ribbon." She paused, searching the older woman's eyes. "My father said you were a stalwart friend of the North." Lady Waynwood's mouth tightened, and she exhaled slowly. "That is enough. I believe you. You have your mother's features and your father's calm. I see it now." She took a step closer, scanning Sansa's face by the moonlight. "So you survived King's Landing, the Lannisters, and now Petyr Baelish. How?" Sansa let out a shaky breath. "He took me under his protection, or captivity, if you'd rather. I had no choice but to obey, to wear the name Elaine Stone. He has used me as a piece on his board, but I cannot bear it any longer. I want the Vale to be free of him, and I want to reclaim my own name, my own birthright. But I need help. I cannot do it alone." Lady Waynwood nodded, her expression grim. "His hold grows every day. The lords declare and squabble, uncertain if they can oppose him. Some fear retribution. Some are tempted by his promises." Sansa clenched her hands. "But if we join together, if the Vale Lords realize that the rightful daughter of House Stark stands with them, that Petyr Baelish is not unstoppable, do you think they will rally to us?" "They might," Lady Waynwood allowed. "The Vale has always had a history of loyalty to the Starks. Jon Arryn fostered Ned Stark in these mountains. That bond is remembered. But Petyr Baelish has sown confusion, cast your identity into doubt. He claims you are Elaine Stone, his bastard daughter, and few have dared question him openly. To challenge him publicly, you must prove beyond all doubt that you are Sansa Stark. And you must have the Lord's declarant in attendance, so that there is no turning back once revealed." Sansa's throat tightened. "I will do it," she said firmly. "I will stand before them, proclaim myself, and condemn Petyr for murder and treachery." He pushed Lady Lysa Arryn through the moon door. "I saw it with my own eyes." Lady Waynwood's mouth set in a line. "We suspected as much, but had no proof. If you can testify to that, the Vale will not stand for it." Lysa was not well liked, but that was still kinslaying in their eyes. Sansa nodded. The memory of that night chilled her. "Where can we do this? If we are still in the Eyrie, Petyr holds all the cards. He has Robert Arryn in his pocket, so to speak, and the Eyrie's gates are controlled by his men." Lady Waynwood considered. "Come to Ironokes, my keep. In a fortnight, I will arrange a gathering of the Lord's declarant under the guise of addressing some new threat from the mountain clans. Petyr Baelish might come if he chooses, or he might send representatives. In either case, you will have a chance to speak. I will hide you until the right moment. Once you declare yourself, we will have enough swords to keep Petyr from simply silencing you, assuming enough of the Lord's side with us. Are you willing to take that risk? It was a desperate plan, reliant on the unpredictable loyalties of Vale lords, and yet Sansa could see no better chance. But Petyr is cunning. He might refuse to come, suspecting a trap. He might keep Robert away. If Robert is not there, Sweet Robin's presence would help, but it may not be strictly necessary. The boy is frightened, easily swayed. If you speak truth, if the lords see you in person, they might override Petyr's claims to guardianship, especially if we present enough evidence of his crimes. Lady Waynwood paused, folding her arms. And we do have some suspicion from the coin he's been diverting and from the questionable alliances he's forging. None of it alone is enough to topple him, but combined with your testimony, it might suffice. Sansa blew out a long breath, feeling equal parts hope and dread. Tell me what I must do. The next hour passed in a hurried, whispered conversation. Lady Waynwood explained how she would smuggle Sansa to Ironokes after the party left Sky's End. They would arrange a minor incident, perhaps a ruse that Sansa had been abducted by mountain clans, or that she had fallen ill and needed urgent care. Lady Waynwood herself would have some of her men in place to intercept Sansa on the road. The details were vague, but Sansa clung to every scrap of them. They would communicate through more coded letters. At last, the older lady stepped back. I must return soon before I am missed. My presence here is already risky. You be safe, child. Trust no one else. If you are discovered, I fear what Baelish will do. Sansa nodded, swallowing her fear. She reached out impulsively and grasped Lady Waynwood's hand. Thank you, she said softly. Her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. I will not forget this kindness. Lady Waynwood's face softened just a fraction. House Waynwood remembers its friends, she said. And we remember the honor of the Starks. They parted. Lady Waynwood remounted and vanished into the trees with the soft clatter of hooves. Sansa waited, her mind whirling, until she felt certain the lady was gone. Then she led her mare back along the winding path, returning to Sky's End as quietly as she had left. She slipped through the small gate once more, thankfully still unguarded. The stable boy, who had not moved from his station, started when she appeared but quickly helped her stable the horse. He seemed relieved to see her return alive. She pressed another coin into his hand. Nothing happened, she whispered. You never saw me. He nodded, eyes wide, clearly not wanting to be involved any further. Sansa returned to her room, easing open the door and slipping inside with her heart pounding. She unfastened her cloak and dropped onto the bed, breathing shakily. She had done it. She had allies. True allies, not cunning opportunists like Petyr Baelish. And now she had to maintain the charade until the moment was right. The next day, she performed her usual role with Robert, aiding him through breakfast. Petyr was there, of course, coolly observing. She feigned a slight headache from the restless night, attributing it to the dryness of the air. He did not seem suspicious. In fact, he appeared almost cheerful, possibly because Robert had enjoyed the travel more than expected. The Child Lord was talking about continuing to a nearby town in the Vale to receive the homage of local knights. Petyr nodded, indulging the boy's fancy, but Sansa knew he would only do so if it served his schemes. She listened quietly, offering no opinions. But inside, she was thinking, let us go. Let us pass near Ironokes. She guessed that Lady Waynwood was counting on a route that led them close enough to stage the ruse. If Petyr chose a different path, everything would be undone. Fortunately, Robert insisted, and when the retinue departed Sky's End the following morning, Petyr relented to follow the main roads that wound through the Vale's lower regions, passing near a handful of minor seats, including Ironokes. Sansa tried to keep her composure as the small procession made its way. In Robert's presence, she made small talk, teased him about the local knights, did everything that might keep him in a pleasant mood. At times, she caught Petyr studying her with a faint smirk, as though he saw something new in her. She wondered if he sensed her growing confidence. But if he did, he said nothing. On the third day of travel, they followed a road that skirted a dense forest. The sun was high, the sky a clear blue, and the morning air crisp. Robert rode in a lavishly furnished litter, grumbling occasionally about the jostling. Sansa rode beside him in another litter, parted by a thin curtain so he could speak to her if he wished. Petyr and a handful of knights rode ahead. The rest of the men-at-arms followed behind, creating a procession of perhaps 24. They had nearly reached a point where the road curved around a rocky outcropping. Beyond that lay the path to Eyrie. Sansa felt her pulse quicken. This must be where Lady Waynwood would stage something. An ambush by mountain clans. A feigned accident, something. She braced herself, keeping her expression neutral. Suddenly, a shrill cry rang out. "Riders! Riders to the left flank!" Sansa's heart lurched. She drew back the curtain, peering out. She saw a band of men on horseback emerge from the treeline, clad in mismatched leathers, brandishing crude weapons. It seemed real enough that her stomach twisted in genuine fear. Had Lady Waynwood truly employed such ruffians? Or were these actual mountain clans come to attack them? She prayed it was the former, that no real harm would befall them. Petyr shouted for the knights to form a perimeter around Robert's litter. Steel rang as swords were drawn. The men-at-arms rushed to meet the attackers. The riders unleashed a volley of arrows, and Sansa heard the thud as some struck shields, and a scream as one of the Vale men fell. This was no mere charade, she realized with horror. Whether orchestrated or not, real blood was being spilled. Her litter swayed as the horses spooked. Robert wailed from behind his curtain. Sansa heard him shouting her name, calling for Elaine in a voice shrill with terror. She hesitated. Was this the moment to slip away? Lady Waynwood had said they would provide her an opening. But what if they had lost control of the situation? Then, one of the riders broke through the defensive line, galloping straight for Robert's litter. Petyr and several knights raced to intercept. Sansa seized her chance. She threw open the door of her litter and jumped to the ground, staggering slightly as her feet hit the dirt. She looked around wildly, searching for any sign of help or instructions. A wave of panic crashed over her. If this was the wrong time, if no one was coming for her, a hand grabbed her arm. She whirled, ready to scream, but the person holding her wore a half-visor helm with the sigil of House Waynwood on the surcoat. He shoved a cloak into her hands. "Come with me, my lady," he hissed. "Hurry!" She nodded, heart hammering, and followed him away from the main fight, ducking behind the outcropping of rocks. The clang of steel echoed in her ears, along with Robert's frantic cries. She felt a surge of guilt leaving him behind, but she told herself this was for the greater good. If she succeeded, Robert would be freed from Petyr's manipulation as well. They scrambled up a narrow footpath that wound around the rocks. Ahead, 2 more men with the Waynwood sigil waited with horses, each with a hand on the reins. They helped Sansa mount one of the horses, then quickly remounted themselves. "We must go swiftly," one of them urged. "The fight will draw Baelish's attention, but not forever." Sansa nodded, struggling to keep her balance on the saddle. She had to trust these strangers. They galloped away from the road, plunging into a dense copse of trees. She glanced back only once, seeing the faint glint of swords in the distance, hearing the echo of shouts. The swirl of dust and chaos was terrifying, but she had no time for fear. She urged the horse to keep pace, gripping the reins. Tears burned in her eyes, the mixture of relief, terror, and adrenaline overwhelming. They rode for what felt like hours, navigating hidden trails and crossing a shallow creek that splashed water over her boots. The men said little, focusing on speed and stealth. Sansa rode in silence, trying to calm her thundering heart. If this was truly Lady Waynwood's doing, it meant she had risked open bloodshed to free Sansa. It also meant the plan was now in motion, no turning back. Eventually, they emerged onto a broader path, still under the cover of tall pines, where more riders waited. One of them wore the distinct armor of House Waynwood's guard captain, a tall man with graying hair at his temples. He dipped his head in deference when Sansa arrived. "My Lady Stark," he said gravely, "Lady Waynwood awaits you at Eyrie. We shall bring you there safely." She swallowed. "Thank you," she managed. "Were any of our men hurt badly back there?" The guard captain's jaw tightened. There were casualties, but the ambush was carefully arranged to be small in scale. "Some men will die, but no more than necessary to sell the illusion of an actual raid. Baelish will believe it was a true mountain clan attack, though he may suspect otherwise. Enough riders escaped to speak of it." Sansa's stomach twisted. Even a single death weighed heavily on her conscience, but she tried to remind herself that war had claimed thousands, that her own family had been torn apart. This was the reality of the game in which she found herself. A game her father had never wanted her to play, but play it she must if she hoped to survive. She forced down her grief, giving a small nod. "I understand." The guard captain gestured for her to continue onward. The riders formed a protective circle around her, and off they went at a more measured pace. They had to maintain caution now, ensuring they weren't followed. Sansa felt as though she were living in a dream. This was the first time she had escaped Petyr's clutches, the first time in so long that she was traveling without his oversight. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying at once. They reached Eyrie after dusk on the following day. A warm glow lit the windows of the keep, and the oak trees around the castle swayed in a gentle breeze. Sansa was exhausted, her muscles aching from riding so long, her nerves frayed. The guard captain announced her at the gate, and the sentries ushered them in without question. She felt stares upon her, servants, guards, all curious about this mysterious arrival. Inside the great hall, Lady Waynwood stood to greet her. Her stern face was lined with fatigue, but she offered Sansa a formal bow, then a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Welcome, Lady Stark," she said, not raising her voice. "You are safe here." Safe. The word felt fragile on Sansa's tongue. Her legs trembled as she dismounted, nearly collapsing from the strain, but Lady Waynwood supported her. Servants appeared, offering water, warm towels. Sansa gulped from a cup, then looked at Lady Waynwood with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. We repay the debt we owe to House Stark, for your father's past deeds, and for the hope of the future," Lady Waynwood replied. Then she waved a hand, dismissing the servants. "We must speak privately." Sansa followed her into a modest solar, where a crackling fire banished the evening chill. A sturdy oak table bore a few scrolls and some half-written letters. Lady Waynwood gestured for Sansa to sit, and Sansa sank into the chair, letting out a long breath. "How soon can the lords gather?" Sansa asked, her voice soft. "Every day I remain hidden. Petyr gains time to maneuver. He will no doubt realize I'm missing, and if he guesses I'm here—" "We have sent ravens to the principal lords already," Lady Waynwood said. "They are to convene here in a week's time, under the premise that I wish to discuss a matter of mutual defense against mountain clans. Some have already agreed to come, others are more reluctant. With luck, we will have enough to form a council." Sansa nodded. "And what then?" "Then you will appear, Sansa Stark in truth, bearing witness to Petyr Baelish's crimes. I will stand with you, and I pray that Lord Royce, Lady Anya's cousin, will also stand with you. We have reason to believe he despises Baelish's hold over the Vale. Others may follow if they see the tide turning." Lady Waynwood's mouth tightened. "But if not enough lords stand with us, or if Baelish arrives with a larger force, it could turn into open conflict. Are you prepared for that?" Sansa's eyes closed briefly. "I must be." Lady Waynwood regarded her with an almost maternal concern. "I will do what I can. For now, rest, eat, gather your strength. We will have time to plan further." And so Sansa found herself sequestered in Eyrie, sleeping in a comfortable chamber draped with tapestries, the bed piled high with quilts. She had privacy for the first time in ages. She could stare out the window at the oak trees and taste the air of freedom without fear that Petyr's steps would approach her door. But with that freedom came the weight of responsibility. She often woke in the night, stomach churning, imagining how Petyr would respond once he realized she had vanished. He would question everyone at Sky's End, interrogate the stable boy. He might guess she had engineered a secret meeting with Vale lords. If he arrived here in force, She might be forced to flee again, or worse, forced to confront him directly without the backing of enough lords. Night after night, she stood at the window, biting her lip, whispering prayers to the old gods and the new. Days slipped by, each one filled with hushed conferences between Sansa and Lady Waynwood as they laid out the plan. The week ended, and the lords began to arrive. They came with small retinues, curious and cautious. Lord Royce was among the first, clad in his imposing armor. When he saw Sansa, truly saw her, he went rigid, his face etched with shock. He listened to her testimony in private, and by the end, tears glistened in his eyes as he recalled Ned Stark's memory. He swore his support. One by one, a handful of lesser lords followed. Some arrived in a swirl of self-importance, only to be stunned when they discovered the reason for the gathering. A few recognized Sansa's features, saw the tully color of her hair, or the stark lines of her face, and they believed. Others demanded more proof. She answered every question, dredging up old childhood memories of visits to the Eyrie or encounters with their families in Winterfell. She spoke with quiet determination, summoning the confidence she never used to possess. When the final day of the council arrived, they assembled in Ironwood's great hall, a vaulted chamber with oak beams and stained glass windows that let in colored light. Long tables had been arranged to seat the lords. At the head was a dais for Lady Waynwood, who had chosen to preside, but to one side a seat was prepared for Sansa. She stood behind a curtain, trembling slightly, as Lady Waynwood called the meeting to order. Among those who had come, some wore suspicious frowns. Others looked around anxiously. Lord Royce sat near the front, arms folded, unwavering. But Sansa's gaze darted around, seeking the one face she dreaded. Petyr Baelish. Would he appear at the last moment, sweeping in with a cunning smile, prepared to unravel all her plans? He did not. As the hall settled into silence, Lady Waynwood cleared her throat. Lords of the Vale, we gather here today to address the state of our great region. We have been under the guidance of Petyr Baelish, who serves as Lord Protector to our young Lord Robert Arryn. Yet concerns have arisen. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lady Waynwood went on, describing how the Vale's honor had been overshadowed by secrecy, how the rightful alliances forged by Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark were being eroded by Baelish's scheming. She spoke of coin unaccounted for, deals made behind closed doors, suspicious deaths, of which Lysa Arryn's might be the most disturbing. At last, she gestured, and one of her knights ushered Sansa forward. The murmuring swelled, an undercurrent of shock as the lords glimpsed her face. She tried to stand tall. "Lords of the Vale," she began, voice soft. She paused, drawing in a breath, letting her tone strengthen. "My name is Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard Stark, once Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. I was taken by the Lannisters in King's Landing, forced to wed, and then smuggled away by Petyr Baelish. He has held me under his power, forcing me to pretend to be his bastard daughter, Elaine Stone. I come before you now in the hope that you will help me reclaim my birthright and free the Vale from Lord Baelish's grip." The hall erupted in chatter. Some voices demanded proof. Others exclaimed that she was the very image of her mother, or that she was a cunning impostor. But she had anticipated these questions. Calmly, she recounted details of her father's time in the Vale, references to the Arryn household that only a true Stark or a close confidant could know. She produced a letter from Lady Waynwood, written in coded reference to old events known only to both families. Lord Royce stood, testifying that he had spoken with Sansa at length and found her claims genuine. Another lord, an older man who had once visited Winterfell, recognized her as the little girl who had danced at King Robert's feast. Bit by bit, the doubters grew quieter. When the cacophony had lessened, Sansa took one more breath and spoke of Lysa Arryn's death. How Petyr Baelish had pushed her through the moon door, how he had silenced the truth by threatening Sansa with the same fate. Her hands trembled as she recalled the scene, but she forced herself to speak clearly, naming Petyr's betrayal. She saw shock and revulsion on the faces of several lords. Some exchanged grim glances, as though they had suspected foul play, but had not dared believe it. By the time she finished, a hush had fallen. Lady Waynwood's voice rang out, calm but firm. I stand as witness to Lady Sansa Stark's truth. I ask now that we, the Lords of the Vale, unite in defending our region's honor. We cannot allow such treachery to rule over us. Lord Royce slammed a fist against the table. I am with Lady Waynwood. Petyr Baelish must answer for these crimes. Another lord, younger and clearly hesitant, rose to his feet. But where is Lord Baelish? Should we not give him a chance to defend himself? Sansa spoke up, her voice unwavering. He will come if he dares. But ask yourselves, why is he not here today? The summons was sent. If he feared no guilt, he would stand among you now. Some nodded, though a few still looked uncomfortable. One older knight cleared his throat. And what of Lord Robert Arryn? He remains under Baelish's care. Should we not be concerned for the boy's safety? A ripple of concern passed through the hall. Sansa bowed her head. I worry for Robert. He is my cousin. But if the Vale stands together, we can demand his release from Baelish's custody. For the child's sake, we must act quickly. Petyr Baelish is cunning, and if we allow him to hold Robert, he holds the Vale itself hostage. At this, a sudden thud sounded at the hall's entrance. The doors swung open, and in strode Petyr Baelish. Sansa's breath froze in her throat. He wore a dark cloak lined with fine velvet, and his usual half-smile curved his lips. A retinue of men behind him, knights loyal to him, parted the crowd, though they were fewer in number than the assembled Vale lords. Sansa, he said, in that deceptively soft voice, as though he addressed a naughty child. You have been busy, I see. Her heart thundered. The hall erupted again, some shouting for Baelish to be seized, others demanding to hear his side. Sansa stood rooted to the spot, forcing herself not to quail under his penetrating gaze. She saw anger there, but also calculation. He had come. Perhaps he believed he could spin this entire meeting in his favor. Lady Waynwood stepped forward, gesturing for silence. Lord Baelish, she said icily, it seems you have arrived just in time to answer accusations of murder and deceit. The Lords of the Vale demand you speak. Petyr inclined his head, as if untroubled. Of course, he said, stepping forward with a confidence that made Sansa's skin crawl. I have heard strange rumors. An impostor claiming to be Sansa Stark? My dear Elaine, how could you do this? He addressed Sansa directly, his tone dripping with feigned betrayal. Sansa lifted her chin, though fear stabbed her chest. I am Sansa Stark, as we both know, Petyr, and you cannot deny what you have done. He approached, ignoring the lords who bristled at his gall. My friends, he said, turning to the crowd. Many of you know me. You know I was a dear friend to Lady Lisa, that she was unstable in her last days. She tried to harm Sansa, if that is indeed who this girl is, out of a mad jealousy. She threw herself through the moon door, as I have always said. Lord Royce scoffed. That's a convenient story, Baelish. Petyr spread his hands. Ask young Robert if you doubt me. He will say the same. He knows how unwell his mother was. He turned to Sansa, eyes gleaming. And here you stand, weaving fantasies. Perhaps you do believe them. I pity you, my girl. A flicker of uncertainty passed over the hall. Sansa could sense it, Petyr's uncanny ability to spin truths from lies. She steeled herself. You threatened me that day, Petyr. You told me if I spoke a word of the truth, I would follow my aunt out the moon door. Her voice quavered slightly, but she spoke loudly enough for all to hear. Do you deny that? He shrugged one shoulder, adopting a gentle expression. If I told you to hold your tongue, it was only to spare you from accusations, my dear. The Vale lords might have blamed you for Lisa's death had they known you were present. I was trying to protect you. Lies, Sansa spat, her voice fiercer now. You played the hero and cast Aunt Lisa as the insane villain. But you know the truth. You married her and then you murdered her. She was never more than a tool to you. The tension in the hall crackled. Lady Waynwood seized the moment. Lord Baelish, she said, her voice cutting. You stand accused of murdering Lisa Arryn, of plotting against the Vale, and of misrepresenting this girl's true identity to further your own ends. We require you to surrender your position as Lord Protector and submit to questioning. If you are innocent, you will have nothing to fear from honest inquiry." A hush fell. Petyr's expression cooled, his fox-like smile fading. "And if I refuse?" Lord Royce rose to his feet, heavy armor clinking. "Then we shall take you by force. We do not lack the authority, nor the swords, to detain you, Baelish." Petyr's gaze flicked around, calculating. He must have realized he was surrounded by lords who, for the moment, stood united in suspicion against him. He forced a laugh, as if to maintain an air of nonchalance. "There is still the matter of Robert Arryn, who is quite firmly in my company, I remind you. What will become of the boy if you seize me?" A grim silence. Sansa felt a pang of worry for her young cousin. She prayed no harm would befall him. But then Lord Royce spoke again. "We will send a detachment of knights to retrieve him from the Eyrie. If you care for the boy's welfare, you will submit peacefully, for your resistance would only create needless conflict." Petyr's lips compressed. Sansa wondered if he had any final card to play. She saw the subtle shift in his posture, the hardness in his eyes. He might try to fight his way out, or slip away through some cunning deception. But the ring of knights around the dais tensed, swords half-drawn. The hall stood against him, more or less united. The tables had turned. At last, with a dramatic sigh, Petyr spread his hands. "So be it. I will submit to the Vale's inquiry, though I warn you, this is all a dreadful misunderstanding." Guards advanced, taking his arms. Petyr made no move to resist, but he locked eyes with Sansa over their heads. She saw fury and a glimmer of something else. Admiration? Hatred? She did not know. A cold knot settled in her stomach. Even in chains, he was dangerous. But she lifted her chin, letting him see no fear. The lords began discussing the terms of his confinement, the details of how to retrieve Robert Arryn from the Eyrie without bloodshed. Voices overlapped, tension mingled with relief. Sansa stood there, trembling slightly, trying to process the moment. Lady Waynwood approached her, expression guardedly hopeful. "You have done it," the lady said softly. "He is in custody." Sansa let out a shaking breath. "He's not gone yet. We must ensure he does not slip free with a bribe or some cunning trick." "Indeed," Lady Waynwood agreed. "But for now you have won the Vale's support. And with that you have your freedom. Tomorrow we will send word to the Eyrie and secure Sweet Robin. Then your position will be unassailable." Sansa nodded, her eyes lingering on Petyr as he was led away by a small contingent of knights, the manacles glinting in the firelight. She felt neither triumph nor joy, only a deep, trembling relief and a hint of sorrow. Petyr Baelish had shaped much of her life with his schemes, and now he stood exposed. But the cost had been high: deaths, betrayals, nightmares. Perhaps he had taught her more than she wished to learn about the nature of this cruel world. A swirl of lords pressed around her, some offering congratulations, others apologizing for ever doubting her. She received them with quiet dignity, mindful of what this moment meant. For the first time since leaving Winterfell, she was openly Sansa Stark, recognized by others, not hiding behind a false name. It felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into the light. She was exhausted, battered by fear and uncertainty, but she was free. That night, she lay awake in a bed within Lady Waynwood's keep, staring at the canopy overhead. She thought of her mother, of how Catelyn Stark would have handled these politics, perhaps with more confidence, more skill. She thought of her father, who believed in justice. She clutched the blankets to her chest, letting silent tears fall as she remembered their faces. In her mind, she saw Ned Stark kneeling before King Joffrey in King's Landing, confessing to false treason to save his daughters. She saw Catelyn's last stand at the Red Wedding. She saw Lady Lysa's terror as Petyr pushed her through the moon door. And now, she saw herself standing in that hall, condemning Petyr Baelish before the lords of the Vale. She had told the truth, not to gain power for power's sake, but to free herself from a manipulator's grasp. Yet ironically, in doing so, she had claimed a sort of power. The Vale looked to her now, a Stark, for leadership and alliances. The northern banners might flock to her if they knew she was alive. The realm was still fractured, the war not truly over. But for tonight she had carved out a space for herself, a place to breathe. A whisper of wind drifted through the window, carrying the scent of oak and fresh leaves. She closed her eyes, hearing the faint rustle, and for a moment, it reminded her of the godswood in Winterfell, the quiet hush beneath the heart tree's red leaves. She allowed herself a fleeting dream of returning home. Her home might be in ruins, her family scattered or slain, but the North still stood, waiting. She resolved that when she was ready, when the Vale was stabilized and Robert Arryn was safe, she would look to the North again. She would restore House Stark in whatever way she could. The next days were a whirlwind of negotiations. Letters flew back and forth to the Eyrie, demanding that Robert Arryn be delivered to Lady Waynwood's care until the matter of Petyr's guilt was resolved. Some of Petyr's men refused at first, then yielded under mounting pressure from the Lord's declarant, who threatened to march on the Eyrie. Robert arrived under heavy escort, pale and trembling, bewildered by the sudden turn of events. He clung to Sansa like a child lost in a nightmare. She did her best to soothe him, explaining that Lord Baelish had done terrible things, but that Robert was safe now among his own people. Officially, Robert Arryn named Sansa Stark as his advisor and caretaker, a role that Lady Waynwood helped arrange. The Vale Lords, seeing how easily swayed the boy could be, agreed that Sansa was a suitable guide. She was a Stark close kin, and by all accounts devoted to him. Sansa accepted the burden, knowing it was a step towards stabilizing the Vale. She would not be a puppet master like Petyr, but she would protect the boy from those who might use him. Petyr Baelish languished in a secure tower cell. He tried to bribe his captors, to persuade them of his innocence, but the lords were in no mood to trust him. A formal trial loomed, though some whispered that a swift execution might be best. Yet Sansa insisted on a fair hearing before any final decree. She did not want to stoop to the same treachery Petyr had practiced. She wanted the truth laid bare. Each time she thought of confronting him again, her stomach knotted. Part of her wanted to see him, to ask why he had done all he had, why he had destroyed her aunt, manipulated her mother, betrayed her father. But another part of her feared falling under his spell of half-truths and illusions. For too long he had controlled her life. She would not give him that power again. Some nights, she stared at the moonlight on her floor, recalling the times at the Eyrie when she'd gazed down into the swirling mists from the moon door, expecting death at any moment. Now she stood in a fortress of her own making, with the Vale Lords at her side. Felt surreal, precarious, but she had come too far to relinquish her claim. Word spread beyond the Vale of Sansa Stark's reappearance, of Petyr Baelish's downfall. Ravens flew north to the Riverlands, to the remnants of the Northmen who might rally around Ned Stark's eldest daughter. Whispers in taverns spoke of the maiden who outfoxed the fox himself. Some said it was justice, others shrugged, calling it another turn of the endless Game of Thrones. For Sansa, it was a beginning, a chance to shape her own fate. When at last she mustered the courage to visit Petyr's cell, she did so with a pair of guards. The tower was cold, the spiral stairwell lit by sputtering torches. She had chosen to see him because the trial was scheduled for the next day, and she wanted to look him in the eye one last time, to ensure she would not waver. The guards unlocked the heavy iron door, and she stepped inside, her posture straight, her face serene. He sat on a small cot, still dressed in fine clothes, though they were rumpled and dirty from confinement. His hair was unkempt, his eyes shadowed. At the sight of her, he stood, inclining his head. "My Lady Stark," he greeted, no trace of irony in his tone. She said nothing at first, letting the silence hang between them. She met his gaze, searching for any sign of regret. She found none. "You've grown into quite a formidable woman," Petyr said softly. "I remember the frightened girl who clung to my arm, desperate to escape King's Landing." "I was desperate," she replied. "You rescued me from the Lannisters, but you never intended to truly free me. I see that now." His mouth curved in a faint smile. "You were always free to choose, my dear. You simply had no better options until now." She drew in a breath, forcing calm. "Did you ever care what happened to me? Or was I only a piece in your schemes?" He let out a soft sigh. "I cared for your mother more than you know. She was the sun in my sky for many years. But she chose Ned Stark." His gaze drifted toward the barred window. "You are your mother's daughter, similar, yet different. I thought, perhaps, I might shape you into something extraordinary." Bitterness welled up in Sansa's throat. "Shape me?" He nodded. "Yes, and I succeeded, didn't I?" His eyes flicked back to hers, a strange pride in them. "Look at you now, orchestrating my downfall. You have become every bit the player I hoped you would be." She clenched her fists. "I am not a player of your game, Petyr. I act for my family, for the Vale, for justice, not for personal gain or the thrill of deception." He tilted his head, unconvinced. "Oh, but deception is in your blood now, Sansa. You have learned well. Perhaps that's why you were able to turn the lords against me. Because you used all the lessons I taught you." Tears of anger pricked her eyes. She refused to let them fall. "I came here not to argue, only to tell you that tomorrow you will face the lords in trial. They will pronounce your fate. I will not show you mercy, but neither will I soil myself with treachery. You will be judged fairly. If you have any final confessions, you should consider them." He stepped closer, the guard beside her tensing. She did not retreat. Petyr studied her face, that calculating gleam never leaving his gaze. Then he reached out, daring to touch her cheek with the backs of his fingers, so lightly it was almost a caress. The guard moved to stop him, but Sansa raised a hand, halting the intervention. She let Petyr's fingers brush her skin, just for a moment. "That's a brave stance," he murmured. "You truly have grown beyond the frightened bird. If I am to meet my end tomorrow, then let it be said that I was proud of you, Sansa Stark." She pulled away, her face betraying no emotion. "Guards," she said quietly, and they moved to escort her out. At the door, she paused, her back to him. "Farewell, Petyr." Then she departed without looking back, ignoring the knot in her stomach. That night, sleep came in fitful snatches. She woke at dawn, dressing in a dark gown trimmed with silver, a stark color reminiscent of winter. She braided her hair in a simple style, stepping into the role she had claimed. Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce escorted her to the great hall, where the lords had gathered again. Petyr Baelish was brought forth in chains, defiant in his poise. Robert Arryn, pale and shaking, sat in a seat of honor, though he barely understood the proceedings. The trial was swift. Lords Royce and Waynwood presented evidence of embezzlement, of covert deals with the Lannisters, of suspicious circumstances around Lysa Arryn's death. Sansa testified once more, describing that fateful night at the Moon Door. Petyr attempted to refute her words with his usual silver tongue, but the assembled lords were not swayed. The tide of sentiment was firmly against him now. By midday, the verdict was clear. Petyr Baelish was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to death by beheading, a punishment that would be carried out at once. Robert Arryn quaked at the sentence, his eyes filling with tears, but he could not muster more than a soft protest. "Petyr was kind to me sometimes," he mumbled, but even he did not have the will to stand against the gathered lords. Petyr was led to the courtyard, still dignified, still wearing that slight, mocking smile. Sansa stood at the edge of the crowd, hands clasped tightly. She did not want to watch, but she forced herself to bear witness. To flinch from this moment would be to deny the gravity of what had transpired. A tall knight with a steady hand took up the Valyrian steel sword that Lord Royce provided. Petyr knelt, his eyes scanning the faces around him. Finally, they locked on Sansa's, and he gave a slight nod, as if to acknowledge her triumph. Then, in a single brutal motion, the sword fell. It was over. A hush reigned in the courtyard. Some of the lords looked grim, others relieved. Sansa stood rooted, feeling a tumult of emotions swirl within her. relief, sorrow, anger, a sense of emptiness. The man who had so profoundly shaped her life, for both ill and good, was gone. She wondered if she should feel some catharsis, but instead she felt hollow, as if a great storm had passed, leaving her in a quiet aftermath. Lord Royce approached, offering a solemn bow. "Lady Stark, justice has been served. The Vale is yours to guide, with Lord Robert, should you wish it." She thought of the burden that lay ahead, the fragile leadership she would have to provide. She thought of the North still ravaged by war. She thought of how she wanted to rebuild her home, find her siblings if any yet lived. But the Vale needed a firm hand to protect Robert, to keep out the Lannisters' influence. She was not the meek girl she once was. She could do this for a time, until the boy was old enough or until she found a suitable regent. She would do her duty, as her father had taught her. She turned her head to see Robert staring at the headless corpse, eyes wide. She moved to him, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. "It's done," she said quietly. "Come away." He nodded numbly, letting her lead him back inside, away from the grim tableau. In the weeks and months that followed, Sansa Stark presided over the Vale's affairs as Robert's chief counselor, with Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce supporting her. They set about healing the wounds Petyr's machinations had caused. Some men who had served Petyr were pardoned if they pledged loyalty to Robert and Sansa, while others fled or faced punishment for deeper complicity. The Vale began to strengthen its borders, forging alliances anew with the North's loyalists once contact was re-established. Though the scars of war still lingered, and though winter itself loomed closer, Sansa found a strange peace in guiding the Vale. She walked through Iron-Oak's groves in the mornings, feeling the crisp air on her cheeks, reminding herself she was no longer a frightened bird. She was, in her own right, a leader flawed, uncertain, but resolved to serve her people rather than manipulate them. Sometimes, at twilight, she would go alone to an old oak tree near the castle walls, kneel beside it, and whisper her hopes to the old gods she had once prayed to in Winterfell's godswood. She prayed for Arya, Bran, Rickon, and Jon. She prayed for the souls of her mother and father. She prayed that the North would someday be home again. Then she would stand, pressing a hand to the rough bark of the oak, and remind herself that she was free. She had betrayed Littlefinger and claimed the Vale for herself, weaving her own future out of the threads he had tried to control. When she lay down to sleep, sometimes she dreamed of direwolves, one with reddish fur that reminded her of her own hair. In her dream, the wolf ran through the snow-laden forests of the North, howling to the moon, and Sansa, standing in a clearing, lifted her voice to join it. She was no longer caged in the Eyrie, no longer forced to look out from a high perch, longing for a land she could not touch. She was on solid ground, forging her path forward. In that path lay hope for her family's name, for the memory of her father, and perhaps for a realm that had known too much turmoil. The Vale had accepted her, Robert Arryn leaned on her, and the Lord's declarant deferred to her judgment. Petyr Baelish's shadow no longer darkened their halls. She was free to choose her next step. What if Sansa Stark had betrayed Littlefinger at the Eyrie, claiming the Vale for herself? She had done so, and in doing so had proven that a caged bird can learn to fly on its own. She stepped onto the battlements of Iron-Oaks one evening, gazing at the distant horizon toward the snowy peaks. The wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and the promise of winter. She stood unafraid, a Stark of Winterfell. Perhaps the journey ahead was daunting, but she would face it with open eyes and a steady heart. For she was no pawn now, but a player in her own right, and she intended to write a destiny worthy of the name Stark. Sansa Stark stood upon the battlements of Iron-Oaks, the wind tugging at her fur-lined cloak. Below stretched an autumn-hued forest. Bright leaves glinted like scattered coins beneath the dying light. The sun slanted low in the sky, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson. She could smell the tang of the lake that gave Iron-Oaks its name, and hear, faintly, the calls of boatmen mooring their craft for the night. Beyond the forested slopes, the pale peaks of the mountains of the moon loomed, mist gathering in the valleys. The Vale had always been a region of sharp contrasts. Its heights were forbidding, its lowlands lush, its lords torn between old traditions and new realities. Now, it was her responsibility to hold them together. She drew in a slow breath, her gaze distant. The courtyard behind her was full of the clatter of the day's end. Stable boys leading horses to stalls, guards exchanging shifts at the gates, the distant echo of a cook's voice calling for help with the evening meal. The warmth of living thrummed within Ironwood's walls. Yet the memory of Petyr Baelish's final moments still lingered in Sansa's mind, a ghost that refused to fade. She had watched from the edge of the crowd as the sword fell. She had told herself it was justice, and it was, but that did not entirely ease the knot within her. He had haunted her life for so long, and snared her in webs she barely saw until she was trapped, taught her to survive a world of deception. In the end, she had unspooled the net he cast, letting the truth shine through. But a part of her remained quietly afraid, as though expecting him to step from the shadows with that half-smile, reminding her that every victory had a price. Ironwood's courtyard was quiet now in the glow of dusk, though it bustled enough for Sansa's tastes. She preferred some sign of life. A hush made her uneasy, reminding her too much of the cold emptiness in the Eyrie, with its narrow chambers and swirling mists. The Vale had many seats, houses large and small, each distinct in its loyalties, and Ironwood's was among the more venerable. Lady Anya Waynwood welcomed Sansa as if she were one of her own kin, providing her with comfortable rooms, a solar to conduct her growing volume of correspondence, and a place in the large hall that served as a seat of counsel for the Lords Declarant. Lord Royce had visited frequently, still wearing his heavy bronze armor that clinked with every step, reminding Sansa of the man's unyielding nature. Yet as the leaves turned and a cooler wind began to blow, Sansa found herself restless. The Vale might be under her guidance, but the rest of Westeros remained in turmoil. The North, her true home, was rumored to be in the grip of the Boltons, a monstrous injustice that made her throat tighten with anger whenever it crossed her mind. Meanwhile, King's Landing remained under the Lannisters, or at least under the shadow of the Iron Throne. The Riverlands were ravaged. Rumors abounded of a Targaryen queen across the narrow sea, of would-be kings in the south, and of lords in the west who were gathering power. It seemed that the War of the Five Kings had ended only in name, for new conflicts were blooming like weeds across the realm. She stayed out on the walls longer than usual, letting her hair whip about her cheeks. She had braided it earlier, though rebellious strands had come loose in the breeze. In the distance, smoke curled from the chimneys of the towns around Ironwood, a sign that folk were lighting hearth fires for the night. For a moment, she closed her eyes and thought of Winterfell's chimneys belching smoke into the frosty air, the comforting smell of home that she had once taken for granted. She was no longer a girl. She had grown leaner, more solemn, sharpened by suffering. And she was no fool. She understood that the position she now held in the Vale was precarious. The Lords Declarant had not sworn fealty to her in the style of vassals to a liege lord. They had pledged to uphold Robert Arryn and protect the Vale's interests, with Sansa as a guiding hand. Though a measure of genuine respect existed, it was also born of convenience. Many of them had despised Petyr Baelish, and her testimony gave them the opening to rid themselves of him. Now, a shared victory held them together, but that might not last forever. "Sansa," came a soft voice behind her. She turned and found Lady Waynwood, clad in a warm cloak of dark green, her graying hair pulled back from her stern face. The older woman's expression gentled at the sight of Sansa on the wall. "You've been out here a long while. Supper is nearly served. Will you come inside?" Sansa forced a small smile, though her eyes stung from the chilly wind. "Yes, my lady," she said. "I was just thinking." Lady Waynwood nodded, stepping alongside her. Together they gazed down at the courtyard. "I understand. These are uncertain times. We have received more ravens this week. Some from the north, where apparently the Boltons hold sway in Winterfell, though not without unrest. Others from the Riverlands. Walder Frey is said to be losing grip on certain lords who resent him still. The realm is fracturing, and we sit here in the Vale, secure for the moment but hardly untouched by these troubles. A pang of sorrow coursed through Sansa at the mention of the Boltons. She had heard stories of Ramsay Bolton's cruelties, of how they had seized Winterfell after the Ironborn retreated. "It pains me," she murmured, "to think of the Boltons in my home. My father would never have believed that House Bolton could supplant House Stark." Lady Waynwood laid a hand on her arm. "We are not powerless, Sansa. The Vale has resources, men who can fight. We can ally with loyalists in the north. Surely there are many who resent the Dreadfort's rule. If we plan carefully, we might help your people. But not yet, I think. Not until we are certain our foothold here is secure." Sansa studied her face, grateful for her support but wary of risking the Vale in a new war. She remembered how the War of the Five Kings had broken so many houses, including her own. Yet a spark of determination lit within her. She might never have sought to be a leader in battle, but she was still a Stark. If she had the chance to free Winterfell from Bolton rule, she could not stand idle. "We will do what we can," she said at last. "In time. For now, you are right, we must unify the Vale. There are pockets of dissent we have yet to address." "Yes," Lady Waynwood said quietly, withdrawing her hand, "and that is what we must speak of over supper. Lord Royce arrived 2 days ago bearing some troubling news about certain mountain clans and certain rebellious knights loyal to Petyr's memory, if you can believe it. We need your counsel." The older woman gave Sansa a close-lipped smile. "Shall we?" Sansa nodded and followed her from the battlements. They descended a spiral stairwell into the keep proper, the STO. Any steps cool beneath their feet. Torches lit the corridors, and Sansa caught the aroma of roasted game drifting up from the kitchens. At least Lady Waynwood's hall boasted a hearty table, with stews thick enough to keep the chill at bay. They entered a modest dining room. Lady Waynwood preferred a more intimate gathering than the grand feasts that sometimes took place in the great hall. The table was set with platters of bread, cheese, roasted fowl, and boiled vegetables, along with pitchers of wine and ale. Lord Yon Royce sat at one end, still wearing a portion of his bronze armor, though he had removed the vambraces. His broad shoulders looked almost too large for the chair. He stood when Sansa and Lady Waynwood arrived, inclining his head respectfully. Sansa curtsied in return, a gesture she performed with more confidence now that she was no longer forced into submissiveness. She took a seat opposite Royce, while Lady Waynwood settled at the head of the table. The servants made a final round, filling goblets with wine, and then withdrew, leaving the three of them alone. They began with small talk. Lady Waynwood thanked Lord Royce for his timely arrival, offered condolences for a cousin of his who had fallen ill, and so on. But soon enough they turned to matters of the realm. Sansa listened carefully as Royce recounted his latest findings. "It's true enough that the mountain clans remain restless," Royce rumbled, cutting into a piece of meat. "They rarely rally under any banner, but we've heard rumors of more raids along the eastern passes. I suspect they're emboldened by the chaos that Petyr Baelish's downfall has left. They think the Vale is in disarray, easy to plunder." Lady Waynwood frowned. "They forget we still have knights ready to defend these lands." Sansa sipped her wine before speaking. "Lord Royce, you also mentioned trouble from knights who might remain loyal to Petyr's memory. Is that rumor or truth?" Royce's thick brows drew together. "Some might simply be men who benefited from his patronage. Baelish was generous with coin and lands, especially to hedge knights who swore fealty to him personally. Not all of them have accepted his execution as just. They talk in corners, implying that the Vale has been stolen from them. I doubt they'll openly revolt, unless they gather behind a strong leader." Sansa nodded, her mind drifting back to the trial, the tension in the hall. Though the majority of the Lords Declarant had supported Petyr's condemnation, a handful had abstained from the final vote or left Ironokes entirely. "We must ensure no such leader arises," she said softly. "If these men are only grumbling, we can perhaps persuade them back into the fold with cautious diplomacy. But if they are planning to raise arms, we must act swiftly." Lady Waynwood exchanged a glance with Royce. "Precisely. Since the trial, we have tried to remain even-handed. We do not wish to punish those who only served Baelish out of fear or ignorance. But if any conspire against Robert Arryn's rightful rule, we need to root them out." Royce tapped the table with 2 fingers. "The key, as I see it, is to display unity at the top. If they sense cracks among the Vale's lords or see conflict between you, Lady Stark, and the rest of us, they will exploit it. Conversely, if they see us acting in concert, raising patrols, administering fair justice, they might relinquish their rebellion before it starts." Sansa recognized the wisdom in his words. "Then we must gather the Lords Declarant again, and also those smaller houses who were uncertain. Show a united front. Offer them a place in Robert's council. Ask for their input. Let them feel heard. But also quietly keep an eye out for true traitors." Royce grunted in approval. I agree. I can summon them to a gathering at my seat, Runestone, or we can do it here. But Iron-Oaks is your sanctuary for the moment. Would you prefer they come here?" He looked to Lady Waynwood, then Sansa. Lady Waynwood pursed her lips thoughtfully. "We can host them at Iron-Oaks, but perhaps a neutral place might better serve? Some of these lesser lords are wary of me as well, for I took a firm stance in favor of Baelish's downfall. Maybe meeting at the Gates of the Moon, that smaller keep below the Eyrie, would be more symbolic, a place that used to belong to House Arryn. It might remind them of who truly rules here." Sansa considered that. The Eyrie itself was not ideal, too many memories, perhaps. And Robert Arryn, who had been quietly living here in Iron-Oaks under her and Lady Waynwood's supervision, might be heartened to see the keep that once was his mother's seat. But he was still fragile, still prone to trembling fits if unsettled. "It might be wise," she said. "The Gates of the Moon is a large enough keep to host the lords. It lies at the base of the mountain road to the Eyrie. The significance would be clear. Robert Arryn's seat, the Vale's rightful seat. If we're trying to show unity, let it be in the seat that once welcomed travelers to the Eyrie. But are we certain it's safe?" Royce nodded confidently. "It was once under Petyr's command, but many of the guards stationed there have since sworn loyalty directly to Lord Robert. A few may need replacing, but that's easily done." He paused. "But you'll have to be present, Lady Stark. Your presence is crucial. You hold more sway than you know." A flutter of anxiety touched Sansa's stomach. She disliked traveling near the Eyrie again, yet she knew it was necessary. "I will come," she agreed. "Bring Robert as well if he feels up to it. Seeing him might disarm some of these knights still mourning Baelish. Perhaps they will realize the Vale is not so leaderless as they think." Lady Waynwood and Royce exchanged determined nods. The plan took shape over the next course of the meal. They would send ravens summoning the Vale lords, especially the lesser houses and knights, to a council at the Gates of the Moon. A fortnight from now would give them time to prepare. Sansa would escort Robert Arryn under guard, ensuring the boy felt secure. Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce would oversee martial readiness, in case the meeting turned sour. By the time supper ended, Sansa's mind was a swirl of preparations, old worries, and a flicker of hope. She rose from the table, politely excusing herself to retire for the evening. Before she left, Lady Waynwood gently touched her arm. "You're doing well, child," the older woman said softly. "Your father would be proud." Sansa's chest constricted, warmth and sorrow mingling. "Thank you," she said, voice thick. Then she turned and left, making her way to her chamber with measured steps. That night, she dreamed of Winterfell again. The courtyard was blanketed in snow, the weirwood towering overhead, red leaves drifting. She saw faces, her parents, her siblings, all standing in a circle, their voices overlapping in a half-heard melody. Then the scene shifted, and she was standing on the mountainside near the Eyrie, the wind howling, Petyr's voice whispering in her ear, telling her that everything was a lie. She awoke with her heart pounding, tangled in the bedclothes. Only the steady patter of distant rain on the window soothed her, reminding her that she was in Iron-Oaks, safe from old ghosts. She sat up, pressing a hand to her forehead, and closed her eyes. In the fortnight that followed, she threw herself into the tasks of governance. Robert Arryn required gentle reassurance that traveling to the gates of the moon would not endanger him. He fretted incessantly about the winding path, about the possibility of mountain clans. Sansa coaxed him as patiently as she could, employing the softness she remembered her mother once using for Bran when he fell from the tower. Robert, though older than Bran had been, was far more fearful. Yet Sansa's presence calmed him, her voice, her gentle hand on his arm. She found a certain sad comfort in caring for him. He was the last link to House Arryn that she had, besides the memory of her aunt's final, frantic days. Meanwhile, letters flew back and forth. One arrived from Lord Belmore, who wrote in cautious politeness that he would attend. Another from Ser Lyn Corbray, whose flowery words only partially disguised his suspicion. He had benefited from Baelish's coin in the past, and no one was quite certain where his true loyalties lay. Lady Waynwood kept Sansa informed of every nuance, every shift in tone. More encouragingly, a raven from House Grafton of Gulltown confirmed their presence. House Grafton stood to gain if the Vale remained stable, as trade would continue to flow. The day of departure arrived in a swirl of servants packing clothes, arms, and supplies. Lady Waynwood insisted on sending a contingent of her own men to guard Robert's litter, while Lord Royce would ride at the head of the column with a group of runestone knights. Sansa felt a knot in her stomach as she fastened her cloak, the same warm cloak lined with fur that had become her favorite. She stood in the courtyard near the horses, inhaling the crisp, late autumn air. Overhead, the sky was gray, threatening a drizzle. Robert emerged from the keep, flanked by two maids who fussed over him. He wore a heavy cloak of Arryn blue, but his face was pale, drawn with worry. He spotted Sansa and hurried to her side. Sansa, he corrected himself, still unused to her true name. Must we go? The roads, the mountain clans. She gave him a reassuring smile. We'll be well protected, cousin. Lord Royce has sent plenty of knights. Lady Waynwood's men will keep us safe. He toyed with the edge of his cloak. I remember traveling with my mother to the Eyrie once. It was so high, I felt I couldn't breathe. Sansa suppressed a pang of sadness. We won't be climbing all the way to the Eyrie, Robert. The gates of the moon is at the foot of the mountain. You'll have air enough, I promise. She gestured to the litter waiting for him, well cushioned with thick furs and pillows. Come, you can rest there, and I'll ride alongside you if you wish. He nodded shakily, letting the maids guide him inside. Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce appeared soon after, their horses readied. Sansa mounted a chestnut mare, adjusting her cloak and gloves, then took her place near Robert's litter. The column set forth, winding through the gates of Ironokes with the Waynwood sigil fluttering overhead. The journey began uneventfully, passing through gentle hills blanketed in auburn leaves. Now and then, a drizzle would start, lightly misting the travelers, but it never broke into a true downpour. At each small village along the way, they found folk curious but not hostile. Most recognized Robert Arryn's sigil and Sansa Stark's presence. News had spread of Petyr Baelish's downfall, and while some folks still whispered that the little bird from King's Landing had orchestrated it, most simply stared with mild awe or offered a respectful bow. The Vale's small folk seemed more interested in a stable peace than in who, precisely, wore the mantle of power. Robert endured the journey better than expected, thanks in part to the comfortable litter and frequent stops. Sansa made certain he had warm broth at midday, kept him company when he grew fretful. Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce rode at intervals on either side of the column, scanning the hills for any sign of mountain clans, but none appeared. Sansa prayed that the clans wouldn't be brazen enough to attack so large a retinue. On the third day of travel, the slope began to climb toward the mountain pass that led to the Eyrie. Nestled near the base was the Gates of the Moon, an old keep that had been expanded over generations. Its towers rose in a graceful silhouette against the slope above, and beyond it, far up the winding goat track, stood the Eyrie's distant silhouette, half lost in the clouds. Sansa felt a shiver at the memory of that Eyrie fortress. If she never again set foot in those halls with the moon door, she would be content. The Gates of the Moon felt more grounded, more real. They arrived at midday, greeted by the castle steward, a stooped man who introduced himself as Gerald Finch. He bowed deeply to Robert, calling him my lord. Robert perked up slightly, as if comforted by the recognition of his authority. Finch welcomed them inside, where they found that some of the Vale's lesser lords had already gathered, their banners displayed in the courtyard. Sansa recognized House Belmore's sigil, the bells on a purple field, and House Coldwater's gray tower. Servants scurried about, lugging crates of provisions in preparation for a sizable gathering. For a moment, Sansa hesitated in the courtyard, letting the busy swirl wash over her. She felt the pull of memory, how many times she had watched from the edges of gatherings like this as a meek observer. Now she was central to it. She exhaled and reminded herself that she was here to guide and unify, not to hide. They settled Robert in the Lord's suite, a spacious set of rooms that looked out on a garden courtyard. He seemed relieved that the altitude wasn't as punishing as the Eyries. Sansa made sure he had plenty of lemon cakes. He remained fond of sweet things, and then left him under the care of a trusted maid. Meanwhile, she and Lady Waynwood, along with Lord Royce, conferred with Gerald Finch in a small solar to plan the upcoming council. Finch provided an inventory of the men present so far, as well as the expected arrivals over the next few days. House Corbray, House Grafton, House Linderley, House Templeton. Some large, some small, but all part of the Vale's tapestry. Sansa listened, occasionally asking questions, feeling some of her earlier anxiety subside in the face of practical detail. When the meeting ended, Lady Waynwood gently touched Sansa's arm. "Get some rest, child. We have time before the main gathering tomorrow. You've done well." Sansa nodded, weary from the road. She found her assigned chamber down a narrow corridor, a modest but well-appointed room with a hearth. She freshened up, washing away the dust of travel, and changed into a clean gown of dark gray wool embroidered at the cuffs. For a while, she sat by the hearth, staring into the flames, letting her mind roam. She found it difficult to relax. The sense of looming confrontation stirred in her belly. It wasn't that she feared a direct attack here. No, the Vale Lords were not so brash, especially with Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce on guard. But she anticipated friction, whispered discontent, old grudges. Any misstep could unravel the fragile unity she'd built. A knock at the door startled her. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Come in." A guard stepped inside, bowing. "My lady, a messenger from House Corbray requests a brief audience." "Shall I show him in?" Her stomach tightened. Ser Lyn Corbray was notorious for his unpredictability and his sharp tongue. Still, better to hear what the messenger had to say. "Yes, of course," she said. The guard exited, and moments later a young man in Corbray livery stepped through. He offered a quick bow, eyes flicking about the room as if uncertain. "My Lady Stark," he said. "My master, Ser Lyn Corbray, bade me deliver this letter to you privately." Sansa extended her hand, and he placed a small parchment in it, folded and sealed with Corbray's sigil, a raven in flight. She broke the seal carefully. The note was brief and written in a slanted scrawl. "Lady Stark, I have heard much of your rising influence. It intrigues me. I would speak with you alone upon my arrival. The hour is late for formalities, but perhaps we can dispense with them. Yes? Let us see if your cunning outmatches your late mentors. L.C." A flush warmed her cheeks at the note's insinuation. Ser Lyn had always been rumored to have accepted bribes from Petyr Baelish, though no proof had ever been as blatant as the Corbray sword that seemed to find itself in Petyr's service at opportune times. Now, the letter suggested he might be sniffing for new opportunities. She did not relish meeting him alone, but refusing might only provoke him to mischief. She glanced at the messenger. "Tell your master I will receive him tomorrow after midday in a private garden alcove. But I will bring one trusted companion, discreetly. That is not negotiable." The messenger bowed again. "As you say, my lady." Then he departed, leaving Sansa with the letter. She stared at the scrawling words, her pulse fluttering. Ser Lyn was dangerous, capable with a blade, cunning with a lie. If he thought to intimidate or sway her, he might be disappointed. She had endured far worse than his brand of menace. Even so, caution was warranted. That night, she found sleep elusive. She tossed and turned, the Corbray letter dancing through her mind, alongside the memory of Baelish's final smirk. The more she thought of it, the more she worried about stepping back into that game. Handshakes and shadows, deals sealed with coded words. She forced herself to remember. You are no longer a frightened girl. You are not Petyr's creature. If Ser Lyn thinks otherwise, he shall learn differently. Morning dawned with a pale sunlight that filtered through the keep's windows. The council would begin in earnest today. Sansa dressed carefully in a gown of dark blue velvet, simpler than some might choose, but with subtle accents of silver thread. She wished to strike a balance, neither too ostentatious nor meek. She pinned up her hair in a braided crown, leaving only a few auburn strands framing her face. Surveying herself in the polished metal mirror, she felt a momentary pang. Was she trying to look like the lady her mother had been? Perhaps, but she was Sansa Stark, forging her own path. She joined Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce in the castle's main hall, a large space lined with columns. Tapestries of Arryn falcons and mountain vistas hung on the walls, reminders of the great legacy that once shone under Jon Arryn's leadership. Now, the floor was crowded with lords and knights, milling about in groups as they awaited the start of the council. Some recognized Sansa and bowed. Others eyed her curiously. A few gave her polite, shallow smiles. Robert Arryn was seated on a modest dais near the back, perched in a cushioned chair. He looked both excited and nervous, fiddling with the trim of his cloak. Sansa approached him and bowed, prompting him to straighten and try to look more lordly. "Sansa!" he exclaimed in a hushed voice. "Look at them all. So many banners." She smiled. "Yes, you're the Lord of the Eyrie, after all." He gulped visibly. Yes, I am." Before she could speak further, Lady Waynwood called for attention, her voice carrying through the hall. The assembled men and women quieted, turning toward the dais. Sansa stepped aside, allowing Robert to be the focal point. He swallowed, then spoke in a halting voice. I welcome you all to the gates of the moon to discuss the Vale's future. We want peace, yes, and prosperity." He faltered, looking to Sansa. She inclined her head in encouragement, and he managed to continue. We shall hear from all of you, but let it be known that I trust my cousin, Lady Sansa Stark, to speak on my behalf, along with Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce. Together, we will guide the Vale." A ripple of murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding, others exchanging glances. Sansa stepped forward, her voice steadier. "Thank you, my lord. We have come to address certain matters of unity, commerce, and defense. The War of the Five Kings has left its scars. Petyr Baelish's regency cast a shadow, and though he is gone, some among us still feel uncertain. Today we offer clarity. The Vale stands strong under Lord Robert Arryn, and we, his counselors. Invite your council in turn. Let us speak openly." With that, Lady Waynwood motioned to the stewards to begin the process of hearing petitions and questions. It started with practical matters: tolls on the roads, shipments through Gulltown, the maintenance of watchtowers along the mountain passes. Sansa listened attentively, occasionally chiming in with reasoned suggestions. She felt a sense of satisfaction at how the lords, even those who had been ambivalent, replied to her with a measure of respect. She was no longer the docile creature who only simpered politely. She'd learned from every subtle lesson of King's Landing, from the hardships she'd endured. She was not afraid to speak. As the morning wore on, the conversation inevitably turned to rumors of mountain clan raids and the question of how best to secure the Vale's borders. Lord Royce, as master of the gates in old times, argued for rebuilding old fortifications. Others balked at the cost. Sansa proposed forming a rotating patrol system funded by a modest tax that would also handle the roads. That prompted a heated discussion, but it was a constructive one. She watched as small alliances formed among the lords, forging consensus. A midday break arrived, and stewards brought in light refreshments: bread, cheese, fruit, and watered wine. Sansa welcomed the moment of respite. Her throat was dry from speaking, and she felt the press of so many eyes. Lady Waynwood stayed near Robert, ensuring he ate something and didn't fret too much. Lord Royce moved among the lords, speaking in quiet groups, reinforcing arguments. It was then that Sansa spotted Ser Lyn Corbray in the crowd, standing apart. He was a striking figure, lean, dark-haired, with a thin mustache and a sword belted at his hip. He caught her gaze, gave a slight tilt of his head, and stepped out into the corridor. An unspoken invitation. She remembered his letter. He had asked to meet after midday privately. She breathed a steadying breath. She had said she would bring one trusted companion. Quickly, she glanced around and found Maya Stone, a capable young woman with dark hair and a forthright manner. Maya had once guided travelers up to the Eyrie heights and had proven loyal to Sansa since her Aunt Lysa's death. She was no courtly lady, but she understood the Vale's terrain and was adept with a bow. Sansa beckoned her over. "Maya," she said quietly, "I must speak with Ser Lyn Corbray in private, though not quite alone. Would you come with me?" Maya's eyebrows rose. She glanced at the corridor where Corbray had disappeared. "Aye, my lady. I know his sort, smooth tongue, sharp blade. I'll keep watch." Sansa nodded gratefully. "Thank you. Let's go." They slipped out of the hall. A guard tried to follow, but Sansa shook her head, instructing him to remain. She did not want to appear surrounded by a retinue, lest Ser Lyn take offense or claim she had come in bad faith. They walked along a stone passage lit by narrow windows, turning corners until they reached a small garden courtyard, enclosed by high walls on all sides. A single oak tree grew in the center, ringed by a stone bench and a scattering of autumn leaves. Ser Lyn Corbray stood there, arms folded, the tilt of his head suggesting he found amusement in the setting. "Lady Stark," he said, offering a mock bow, "and your companion. Pleasant day, is it not?" Sansa kept her expression composed. "Ser Lyn," she greeted, ignoring his sardonic tone. "We have only a short time before the council reconvenes, so speak plainly. You asked for a private conversation." He let his gaze flick over Maya, then shrugged. "Very well. Shall we sit?" Without waiting for a response, he sank onto the stone bench, crossing one leg over the other. Sansa decided to remain standing, though Maya leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed. Corbray watched Sansa with interest. "I was not certain how accomplished you might be at this game, my lady. I see the others fawning over you in the hall, praising your suggestions, your oh-so-honest counsel. Yet you and I both know honesty only goes so far in times like these." Sansa stiffened. "If you think I intend to bribe you as Baelish did, you are mistaken." His lips curled in a half-smile. "Bribes? Is that what you assume I want? Perhaps, but gold bores me. My house is not rich, but we hold enough land to survive. Besides, Baelish's coin always came with strings attached, and I suspect any arrangement with you would have strings as well." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I wonder if you have the stomach to use me." She narrowed her eyes. "Use you in what sense?" He spread his hands. "Violence, bloodshed. Sometimes words fail. Sometimes swords must speak. I have a sword of my own, Lady Forlorn, a blade with a storied history. I have never shied from unsheathing it." Maya shifted, placing a hand near the hilt of her own dagger. The tension in the courtyard thickened. Sansa drew a breath, remembering all she'd heard. Lyn Corbray had once fought bravely during Robert's rebellion, standing with Jon Arryn, but in recent years his loyalties had grown murky. He had aided Petyr Baelish during key confrontations, but only when it benefited him personally. Corbray was dangerous, unpredictable. "I have no need of Sel's words," Sansa said quietly, "and I will not condone senseless violence." Corbray chuckled under his breath. "All violence seems senseless to those with gentle hearts, yet it is the spine of power in Westeros. You might speak of compromise and unity, but soon enough, you'll find a foe that words cannot tame. What then?" She kept her chin high. "Then I'll do what must be done, with the support of the Vale behind me. I will not hire a lone sword to handle my enemies in the dark." He regarded her with an amused glimmer in his eyes. "So you say, but you might find yourself in a corner you cannot escape by half measures. It happened to Petyr. He lost his head because he failed to see how thoroughly you'd undermined him, how cunning you could be." He rose from the bench, stepping closer. Maya tensed, but Sansa remained still, determined not to show fear. Corbray dropped his voice. "I have no love for Baelish's ghost, nor any loyalty to Robert Arryn, but I admire ambition. If you intend to do more than prattle about trade and taxes, if you intend to carve a piece of this realm and hold it, then you might someday require my talents. I'm merely offering them to you before you find yourself in dire need." Sansa's mouth felt dry. He was dangerous, but also uncomfortably honest in a twisted way. A part of her recalled how Baelish always sought such ruthless allies. It was a path that led to betrayal. Yet she could not entirely dismiss Corbray's words. War was harsh. If the Vale marched north to confront the Boltons or faced other threats, men like Lyn Corbray could tip a balance, one way or another. She measured her response carefully. "I thank you for your offer, Ser Lyn, but I need no private blade. If you wish to stand with the Vale, then swear loyalty to Robert Arryn and the Council, and fight honorably under Lord Royce's command when called upon. If that does not suit you, then do as you will." He studied her face. "And if I prefer to remain an independent actor?" Maya Stone spoke up, her voice cool. "Then you'll be watched carefully, Ser Lyn. We won't let another Baelish slither through the Vale." Corbray threw back his head and laughed, a short, barking sound. "Fair enough. Very well, Lady Stark. You have given me your stance. Let us hope you do not regret refusing my direct approach." He inclined his head in a gesture somewhere between respect and mockery. "Good day to you." He spun on his heel, departing the courtyard. Maya frowned after him, one hand still lightly on her weapon. When he was gone, she turned to Sansa with concern in her eyes. "You think he'll cause trouble?" Sansa exhaled, releasing some of the tension in her chest. "He might, but it's better to know where he stands, or rather, that he stands only for himself. He wanted to see if I would purchase his services the way Petyr did, or rely on him for clandestine deeds. I won't stoop to that." Maya nodded firmly. "You did well not to show fear. He's a viper, that one." Sansa felt relief, tinged with apprehension. "Thank you for accompanying me. Let us return to the hall before we're missed." They made their way back, weaving through corridors that smelled of old stone and the faint scent of autumn leaves that had blown in from the courtyard. The main hall was resuming session, men taking their seats, murmuring among themselves. Sansa slipped in quietly and took her place near Robert, who brightened at the sight of her. Lady Waynwood raised an eyebrow in silent question, and Sansa gave a small shake of her head to indicate that nothing catastrophic had happened. The older woman inclined her head, understanding. The rest of the day's discussions proceeded with less drama. House Grafton's representative spoke of increasing trade routes. House Belmore insisted on more security along the passes. Sansa watched for signs that Corbray might sow discord, but he merely stood near a column, arms folded, occasionally making pointed remarks about the cost of certain proposals. If anything, it seemed he was waiting, biding his time. When dusk arrived, the council broke for an evening meal in the adjacent banquet hall. Long trestle tables were set up, servants bustling to lay platters of roasted game, bread, vegetables, and pitchers of wine. The chatter grew louder as lords relaxed over cups. Robert tired quickly, so Lady Waynwood guided him away to rest. Lord Royce and others circulated, continuing to talk shop even as they ate. Sansa found herself seated between an elderly knight from House Linderly and a stern matron from House Upcliffe, listening to them extol the virtues of rebuilding old alliances that dated back to Jon Arryn's time. She nodded politely, adding her perspective when asked. As the feast wore on, she kept an eye on Corbray's position. He remained near the far end of the hall, exchanging words with a handful of men who had once supported Baelish. But the conversation seemed more casual than conspiratorial. Another memory of King's Landing flickered through her mind. how men would gather in corners at feasts, forging alliances in low voices. She reminded herself that now, she had allies watching too. Even if Ser Lyn tried something, he would not find easy prey. After the meal, Sansa excused herself to the quiet of her chamber, claiming weariness. In truth, she needed a moment to breathe. The day had been a deluge of voices, all wanting something. She had done well, she thought, in navigating the fractious debates. Yet the future felt uncertain still. She lit a single candle by her bedside, drew back the drapes on the narrow window, and gazed out at the courtyard below. The night was still, a slice of moon hanging low. She let the hush soothe her, remembering how once she'd stood on a balcony in the Red Keep, longing for deliverance. She had prayed for rescue, for some night of story to take her away. No night had come. Instead, she had found her own path, guided by chance, by tragedy, by cunning, by a will to survive. Perhaps that was the only rescue any of them ever truly had, the strength they could claim for themselves. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, inhaling softly. Tomorrow, the council would continue, forging more decisions about the Vale's defense. She would stand by Robert's side, shaping policy. If all went well, they would leave the gates of the moon with a stronger sense of unity and an agreement to quell the mountain clans for good measure. Yet her thoughts drifted to the north. Winterfell, a whisper in her mind. You cannot truly be free while the Boltons hold your father's seat. Part of her yearned to gather the Vale's knights, ride north, and cast out the usurpers. But a war was no small undertaking. The Vale had remained largely untouched by the worst of the War of the Five Kings. Throwing it into open conflict might open a wound that would never heal. She recalled Petyr's parting words to her, how he'd said she was cunning, how she'd used everything he taught her. She hated giving him credit, but she did see that strategy demanded patience. First, she must ensure the Vale was locked in her favor. Then she could look north. Perhaps she could seek out any loyal Stark bannermen who remained. A plan formed at the edges of her mind, still nebulous. She resolved that, once this council was over and the Vale's lords were firmly behind Robert's leadership, she would send out feelers, quiet letters to northern houses that might still uphold Stark loyalty in secret. House Manderley in White Harbor, perhaps, or lesser houses scattered across the region. One step at a time. A chill crept into the chamber, so she closed the shutters, leaving only the flickering candlelight. She removed her gown, donned a warm shift, and slipped under the covers of the bed. Sleep came fitfully, as it often did in these uncertain times, but eventually she drifted away. The next morning, the council reconvened early. The lords continued debates about the mountain clans, culminating in a consensus to assemble a combined force from various houses. Each would contribute a small contingent of knights, under Lord Royce's general command. They would conduct a sweep through the known clan territories, pushing them back from the roads and re-establishing control. It was a bold measure, but many felt it necessary for the Vale's safety. Sansa endorsed the plan. Lady Waynwood pointed out that they should also open negotiations with certain clan leaders who might be swayed to peace through trade or resources, but the majority favored a show of force. By midday, they had hammered out the logistics, which houses would send men who would handle supply lines, and how quickly they would muster. A hush fell when the next topic arose, the question of what to do about the wider realm. Did the Vale remain wholly neutral, or did they eventually take sides in the unfolding conflicts? Some whispered that Queen Cersei in King's Landing was losing her grip, that the Iron Throne was a lion's den of secrets. Others mentioned this rumored Targaryen queen in the east, though no official envoy had approached the Vale. Lord Royce opined that for the moment they should keep to themselves, build strength, and let the realm tear itself apart if it would. Lady Waynwood did not disagree, though she cast a sidelong glance at Sansa. Finally, one of the lesser knights rose and spoke what many were thinking. And the north, my lords? House Stark once ruled there, but rumor says House Bolton holds it now. If Lady Sansa is indeed the rightful daughter of Lord Eddard Stark, might we not aid her return, as the Vale once aided Robert's rebellion? A low murmur swept the hall. Sansa felt her cheeks warm at so direct a mention of her claim. She had not forced the issue yet, knowing it was delicate. But she sensed the curiosity in the room. Some saw an opportunity for glory or expansion, perhaps. Others might see it as a fool's errand. She rose, her voice measured. "I am indeed Eddard Stark's daughter, but the North is not so easily reclaimed. It has been ravaged by war, and the Boltons are cruel masters. I would not lead the Vale into a reckless campaign, not without certainty that it could succeed and that it would serve the greater good. For now, the Vale is my first concern." A few heads nodded in agreement, though she saw some glances of disappointment. Yet the seed had been planted, there was talk of a Stark restoration, and that talk would only grow as the Vale solidified its position. Lady Waynwood stood, reinforcing Sansa's words. "We stand behind Lord Robert Arryn and Lady Stark, but it is wise to attend to the Vale's internal matters first. War beyond our borders is not decided lightly." Gradually, the council found consensus that immediate forays beyond the Vale were ill-advised. They would remain vigilant, but avoid entangling alliances until they were certain of their own security. Sansa hid a slight relief behind a calm mask. She desired to see Winterfell freed, but not at the cost of a hasty, doomed invasion. She wanted to gather more information, strengthen the Vale, and perhaps coordinate with any northern loyalists. By late afternoon, the key matters had been largely resolved. They formalized an agreement, with each house pledging men or supplies to the campaign against the mountain clans. It was a moment of rare unity, and Robert Arryn, who had been surprisingly attentive, exclaimed that a feast would be held that evening to celebrate. The hall echoed with cautious applause. Sansa breathed easier. She took time after the session to walk the castle corridors, greeting lesser knights and bannermen, exchanging pleasantries. Everywhere she went, she encountered signs that the Vale was on the cusp of a new era. Some men eyed her with curiosity, others with respect, a few with suspicion. But none could deny that she stood at the center of the region's power now, an axis around which the lesser orbits turned. Felt strange, exhilarating, and heavy all at once. She was nearing the courtyard when she caught sight of Lyn Corbray again, leaning against a pillar. He gave her a small, mocking salute as she passed. She paused, meeting his gaze. "Ser Lyn, did you find the council's decisions to your liking?" He smirked. "As dull as well water, but at least we may see some sport against the mountain clans. I might take my blade there, see if any savage can match me." She studied him, uncertain whether his words were half in jest. "If you do so under Lord Royce's command. We have no need of lone wolves." His eyes danced with amusement. "Worry not, my lady. I shall behave, for now." She inclined her head coolly and moved on, unwilling to be drawn into another cryptic exchange. It reassured her slightly that he seemed content to keep the peace for the moment, presumably because the Vale was clearly united, and he stood little chance of sowing chaos effectively. Still, she did not trust him. Perhaps she never would. Evening arrived, and the celebratory feast took place in a lavish hall draped with Arryn banners. Servants bustled, bringing in steaming platters of venison, spiced vegetables, sweet fruit tarts, and jugs of rich red wine. Musicians played a merry tune on lute and flute, the melody echoing among the high rafters. Robert Arryn presided from a raised chair, though he still seemed ill at ease with so many people gathered. Sansa sat beside him, wearing a fresh gown of soft gray with a direwolf embroidered on one sleeve, her quiet way of reminding everyone of her heritage. She engaged in pleasant conversation with those who approached, careful to avoid any commitments she might regret. Several lords asked about her perspective on trade alliances or her thoughts on the realm's shifting power. She offered polite, measured responses. Occasionally, Robert piped up with a question or a nervous laugh, but mostly he let Sansa handle the complexities. Later in the feast, as cups drained and the music changed to a slower tune, some of the knights invited ladies to dance. Sansa demurred at first, but then Lord Belmore approached with a courteous bow. He was a middle-aged man of moderate girth, affable enough. "My lady, would you honor me with a dance?" Merely a friendly gesture. Sansa hesitated. In King's Landing, she had often felt on display, used as a pawn in the game of dances and gossip. But this was different. She had more control now. So she rose and curtsied, allowing him to lead her to the center of the hall, where a handful of couples were, already moving slowly to the music. She remembered the dancing lessons from her youth. Posture straight, steps elegant, keep your expression calm. She carried them out, letting Lord Belmore's hand guide her as the tune drifted. They spoke little, but she sensed his gratitude that she had accepted. Others watched, some with mild smiles, some with curiosity. When the dance ended, he thanked her and led her back to her seat. Sansa realized with a small pang that such things, dancing, social niceties, could be as important in forging alliances as any formal treaty. In the eyes of these lords, her acceptance or refusal spoke volumes. As the night wore on, the crowd grew looser with wine, but not uncontrollable. The atmosphere was one of cautious celebration. The Vale had not had such a gathering in quite some time. Sansa found herself stepping out into the courtyard for a breath of cool air. The night sky was clear, a sprinkle of stars overhead. The music sounded muffled from behind the stone walls. She listened to the gentle hush, letting her nerves settle. Then she heard soft footsteps. She glanced over her shoulder to see Lady Waynwood approaching, her cloak trailing behind her. The older woman offered a small smile. "Sometimes it's good to escape the noise, isn't it?" Sansa nodded. "I needed a moment to breathe." She turned to face Lady Waynwood fully, noticing the lines of fatigue on the woman's face. "It's been a long 2 days, but I believe we've done well." Lady Waynwood's eyes glinted with pride. "You have led admirably, Sansa. The lords respect you. Most of them, anyway." She paused. "I remember your mother. If she could see you now, she would." The words caught in Lady Waynwood's throat. Sansa reached out and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "I try to do what she would have done." A moment of shared sadness passed between them. Then Lady Waynwood cleared her throat, glancing at the keep's high walls. "Tomorrow, some lords will depart, but the commitments they made should hold. We will gather men to push back the mountain clans. That alone will strengthen the Vale's sense of security. After that, who knows? Some talk of the north, others talk of King's Landing. But I say we remain watchful and steady." Sansa nodded. "Agreed. The Vale must not be drawn into foolish ventures. But that does not mean we do nothing. We can quietly prepare. I have half a mind to send word north, to any lords who might still be loyal to my family." Lady Waynwood raised a brow. "You wish to reclaim Winterfell?" Sansa took a breath. "One day. I cannot pretend otherwise. But not yet. First, the Vale must be stable, strong. Then, if the right moment comes, we can free my home from the Boltons." The older woman laid a hand on Sansa's shoulder. "I will support you in that when the time is ripe. You have my word, as you had it before." Sansa's eyes shimmered with gratitude. In Lady Waynwood, she saw a vestige of the older generation that had once stood beside Ned Stark and Jon Arryn. The bonds of loyalty might have frayed over the years, but they were not completely broken. "Thank you," she said softly. They lingered in the courtyard a while longer, gazing up at the stars, speaking in hushed tones. Sansa felt an unusual peace. She had taken the step of openly governing the Vale. The lords were not revolting, Robert Arryn was safe, and the council had made concrete plans to defend their borders. Ser Lyn Corbray remained a wild card, but for the moment he posed no immediate threat. Petyr Baelish was dead. A few short moons ago that would have seemed impossible. Now Sansa stood on her own 2 feet, forging alliances with men and women who at least listened to her perspective. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies but the pack survives." She had been a lone wolf for too long, but now she was forming a new pack, a fragile one, to be sure, yet it was hers to cultivate. Eventually, they returned to the banquet, which was winding down. Robert Arryn had already been taken to his chambers, exhausted by the day's excitement. A few pockets of revelry remained, knights passing a final cup of wine, servants clearing tables. Sansa excused herself quietly, wishing Lady Waynwood a peaceful night. She climbed the stairs to her chamber. She stood before the mirror again, unfastening the silver wolf pin that held her cloak in place. Her reflection looked back at her with faint circles under the eyes, but an air of resolve in the set of her mouth. A swirl of thoughts filled her, about the next steps, about the alliances made today, about her dreams of returning to the north. Slowly, methodically, she loosened her hair from the braided crown, letting it fall around her shoulders. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Ensuring the lords followed through on their pledges, dispatching ravens to confirm the muster of knights, coordinating with Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce on strategy for dealing with the clans. And beyond that, she must gather information about the north, perhaps by sending a trusted emissary to White Harbor or the Last Hearth, or any place that might harbor a flicker of Stark loyalty. She would do it carefully, quietly. She had learned from Petyr's example, ironically enough, patient, methodical steps. But she would not follow in his moral footsteps. She would not climb upon a pile of corpses to reach her goal if there was another way. A gentle knock came at her door as she was folding her cloak. She tensed, briefly worried about an intruder, but then heard the voice of a servant. "My lady, a letter has arrived for you." She opened the door to find a young woman in plain livery, holding out a parchment. It bore no seal, just a bit of twine binding it. Sansa thanked her, then closed the door and lit the chamber's lantern to read by. The handwriting was cramped, the ink slightly smeared. "Lady Stark, I write to you from the shadows, as the words I carry cannot be put to public lips. I am of the north, born under the watch of Winterfell, though my house's name must remain hidden. We have heard that you live and hold power in the Vale. If you are truly Sansa Stark, and if you yearn for the North's freedom, know that you are not alone. The Boltons hold Winterfell in a grip of terror, but seeds of rebellion stir. If you would aid us, if you would retake your birthright, send word. We have ears in White Harbor, in Deepwood Motte, and even in the towns near the Dreadfort. One day, your banner might fly again above the walls of Winterfell. We will wait for your sign. No name, no signature, just a cryptic promise from someone who claimed to be part of a covert northern resistance." Sansa's heart pounded. A swirl of excitement, fear, and longing coursed through her. She scanned the note again, searching for any clue that this might be a trick. But there was nothing definitive. The handwriting, the style of phrasing, the references to White Harbor and Deepwood Motte. It sounded like someone intimately familiar with the region. Could it be a trap laid by the Boltons? Possibly. Or it could be a genuine attempt by northern loyalists to reach her. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in her hands. This was the next step she had envisioned, the possibility that the North might call to her, that she could gather support to oust the Boltons. But it came sooner than she expected, and in such a clandestine manner. If she answered, she risked exposure. If she ignored it, she might miss the best chance to free her home. Her thoughts churned. She needed time to think, to weigh the Vale's readiness. The Mountain Clan campaign would occupy resources. She could not simply divert them north on a whim. Yet the letter's mention of seeds of rebellion made her wonder how soon the North might move. If she delayed too long, she could lose the moment. Pressing her lips together, she folded the note and hid it within a small wooden chest in the corner of her chamber, locking it carefully. She would share its contents only with Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce, in strict confidence, see what they advised. Perhaps a careful response could be crafted, one that asked for more information while minimizing risk. She exhaled, her mind spinning with possibilities. Sleep would not come easily tonight, she knew. The reflection in the polished mirror caught her eye once more. She studied the woman there, young, but not naive, far from the soft-hearted dreamer she had been. This was the path she had chosen, the path her father's honor and her mother's love guided her to walk. If she faltered, she might lose everything. But if she succeeded, the North could rise again under the Stark banner. She extinguished the lantern, letting the darkness settle. Tomorrow, the morning would bring its demands. A farewell to the departing lords, instructions for mustering knights, more discussions with Lady Waynwood, and always the question, When will Sansa Stark reclaim Winterfell? She breathed in, a slow, deliberate act that calmed her racing heart. She was the last daughter of Eddard and Catelyn Stark who bore their name openly. Somewhere out there, perhaps, her siblings survived: Bran, Arya, Rickon, or even Jon. The realm was wide, and the winds of chaos had scattered them like leaves. She could not rely on those siblings returning to claim the North. She had to stand on her own, and so she would. In the stillness, Sansa felt a small surge of hope. The Vale was hers, at least in trust for Robert Arryn. Petyr Baelish was gone, his manipulations undone by her courage and the Lord's willingness to see justice done. She was free to shape her own destiny, with the cunning she had learned through hardship and the compassion that still glowed within her. If the North called, she would listen. She would weigh each step carefully. But one day, she vowed silently, one day the Stark banner would fly in Winterfell again. And if she had to cross snowy fields and frozen rivers, if she had to endure a war or more cunning foes, she would do so, for she was Sansa Stark, no longer a frightened child in a gilded cage. She was ready to be the wolf her father always believed she could be. The next dawn came shrouded in a pale mist across the keep's courtyard. Lords prepared to depart, bidding farewells, exchanging courtesies. Sansa stood beside Robert as he offered parting words, trying to appear dignified, though he was clearly relieved the crowd was thinning. Lord Royce and Lady Waynwood conferred about the next steps for the Mountain Clan expedition, while the lesser knights readied themselves to ride home and call their banners. The hustle and bustle felt oddly comforting to Sansa. It meant progress, a sense of purposeful movement across the Vale. She spotted Lyn Corbray departing with a small retinue. He cast her a final sardonic glance but said nothing. Others bowed respectfully as they passed, thanking her for her counsel. She responded with polite warmth, ensuring each left with a sense that the Vale was in good hands. When at last the courtyard had cleared, leaving only her own traveling party and a handful of the keep's permanent guard, Sansa sighed softly. "It seems the council is concluded," she said to Robert. "Will you stay here a while longer, or return to Ironokes? Or even the Eyrie if you wish?" She trailed off, uncertain if he might prefer that lofty seat. Robert wrinkled his nose. "I dislike the Eyrie. So high. I like Ironokes better." He glanced at Lady Waynwood, who offered a kind smile. "You don't mind, do you?" Sansa's heart went out to him. He was still just a boy, scared of so many things. She bent slightly, lowering her voice. "We'll go back to Ironokes, if that pleases you, Robert. But soon we'll need to check on other holdings too. Perhaps Runestone or Gulltown. You are the Lord of the Eyrie. Your lords should see you from time to time." He nodded, biting his lip. "Yes, we can do that if you come with me. I like it when you're there." Sansa mustered a smile. "Of course, cousin." Lady Waynwood joined them, having finished a short conversation with Lord Royce. "Very well, we'll return to Ironokes shortly. Lord Royce will remain here for some days, organizing the muster. He'll join us once the men are ready to march against the mountain clans." She lowered her voice, leaning toward Sansa. "And after that is seen to, we can talk about your letter. If it was not a trick, then perhaps we can open a quiet channel to the north." Sansa felt her pulse quicken. "Yes," she whispered, "but let's keep it between us until we know more." Lady Waynwood nodded. Together, they led Robert to the waiting horses and litters. The journey back to Ironokes would take another few days, but Sansa did not mind. She found a certain peace in the road, the rhythmic clop of hooves, the vistas of the Vale passing by. It gave her time to reflect, to plan, to let the threads of her future align in her mind. Her thoughts wandered to the letter's promise, flickers of rebellion in the north, hidden pockets of loyalty to House Stark. Could she truly count on them? How many times had the realm turned on her family? How many betrayals and heartbreaks? Yet she was not alone now. She had the Vale's support. Lady Waynwood believed in her cause, Lord Royce respected her, and Robert, though fragile, offered her the official authority to act in the Vale's name. Even some of the lesser lords, seeing the success of this council, seemed amenable. If the North truly rose, the Vale might ride alongside them. But that day was not yet. She would bide her time, gather facts, and set the pieces in place. That was her father's way. Prepare thoroughly, act decisively, keep faith with those who deserved it. It was also, in a twisted sense, the final lesson Petyr Baelish had taught her. Never reveal your full hand until the moment is right. Combine those approaches with her own compassion, her own sense of justice, and she might reshape the game in a way none of them expected. In the evenings during the ride back, she would sit with Lady Waynwood by the campfire, discussing the day's road and the condition of the men. Occasionally, Lord Royce's messengers caught up with them, bearing updates on the muster of knights. Maya Stone, who had joined the column, reported no sightings of trouble along the mountain paths. The Vale seemed calm for now, though that calm might only be the hush before a storm. They arrived at Ironokes near dusk on the fourth day. Robert sighed in relief to be back in a familiar bed. Sansa felt a twinge of gratitude as well. Ironokes had become a kind of haven to her, a place where she wasn't overshadowed by the ghosts of the Eyrie. The oak groves around the castle glowed in the twilight, leaves fluttering in the breeze. The majordomo welcomed them, leading them inside. Once again, Sansa settled into the routines of Ironokes, receiving letters, holding small audiences with local knights, ensuring Robert's daily needs were met. But now she had a sharper focus. She read each raven's message with an eye for news of the realm, watching for hints of northern strife or kings landing turmoil. She took to writing letters of her own, carefully phrased, addressed to minor lords or merchants rumored to pass through White Harbor. She would mention potential trade expansions or mutual benefit, never openly stating her desire to coordinate against the Boltons, but leaving enough subtle hints that might prompt the right northern loyalists to respond. Lady Waynwood approved of the approach. "It is wise not to reveal your aim too soon," she said. "You do not know who might intercept these letters. Once we've established contact, we can move to more direct communications." So the days slipped by, overshadowed by the slow build of change. Lord Royce sent word that the force against the mountain clans was nearly assembled. He planned to launch the campaign before winter set in too firmly. A victory there would show the Vale's strength. Meanwhile, Sansa received a cautious reply from a merchant in White Harbor, who hinted that Lord Manderley might be open to hearing from his late liege lord's kin. She felt hope bloom. Time flowed in a steady pattern, overseeing Vale affairs by day, scribbling letters by night. Robert Arryn, for his part, grew comfortable at Ironokes, though he still quaked at any mention of traveling beyond. Sansa recognized that his health might never be robust, and he might never be the strong, commanding lord the Vale needed. Yet she could protect him, guide him, and ensure the Vale remained stable for as long as necessary. As the first snows dusted the higher peaks, Lord Royce launched his offensive against the mountain clans. Reports trickled in of skirmishes among rocky passes, the knights pushing back the clans while seizing key vantage points. Casualties were kept low, and victory stories soon spread. The small folk breathed easier, no longer fearing raids. The Vale lords praised the decisive action, further solidifying their respect for the new order, Robert Arryn's rule, guided by Lady Stark's counsel. In the midst of these developments, a coded letter arrived for Sansa. Lady Waynwood brought it to her solar, eyebrows arched in interest. This was delivered by a merchant from the Fingers, addressed specifically to you. The seal is unmarked. Sansa received it with trembling hands. She opened it, deciphering the words that had been written in a basic cipher. Lady S. We have confirmed your identity through certain channels. The North has not forgotten House Stark, though we must tread with care. The Boltons tighten their grip daily, but some houses quietly resist. Word of your ascendancy in the Vale gives us hope. If you would see the flayed man removed from Winterfell, speak your vow, and we shall carry it to those who wait. But be warned, once the vow is spoken, the wolves must be prepared to hunt. We will not move unless we sense true support. Time is short, but haste can be deadly. The choice is yours. A friend in the North. Sansa closed her eyes, pressing the letter to her chest. This was the moment of decision. The North asked her to vow her intent to drive the Boltons out. If she did, the wheels of rebellion would turn. People could die. If she hesitated or refused, the Boltons might solidify their hold, committing more atrocities. She shared the letter with Lady Waynwood and then with Lord Royce, who had returned victorious from the mountain campaigns. They gathered in private, shutting out even Robert for the moment, because the boy did not need such burdens. Sansa explained, "They want my vow, to know I will support an uprising. Likely they wish to know that the Knights of the Vale will stand behind me once the rebellion begins." Royce frowned, stroking his thick beard. "If we commit to war in the north, we risk the Vale's safety. The realm is still fractured, and winter is coming. A campaign in the north during the cold season? That is not lightly undertaken." Lady Waynwood nodded in agreement. "True, though if the Boltons crush any incipient rebellion because we delayed, House Stark might lose its best chance to reclaim Winterfell. And even if we go later, we'd face a stronger foe." Sansa swallowed hard, her gaze flicking between them. She thought of her father, who had died because he underestimated the venom in King's Landing. She thought of her mother, who died trying to rescue her brother. She thought of the slow, cunning approach she had taken to bring down Baelish. This situation demanded a blend of caution and resolve. "I propose we do not vow immediate military support, but rather pledge to coordinate. Let them know we stand ready to act when the time is right, that we will prepare knights for a possible march. But we must also ensure they are strong enough on their own to stand against the Boltons until we can arrive, or at least hold them in check." Royce considered that. An exchange of letters, then. A promise that the Vale is open to alliance, so long as they can guarantee the sincerity of northern houses. "The last thing we want is to ride north and find ourselves alone." Sansa nodded. "Precisely. We want to gather more intelligence, form a plan. The Boltons are cunning, especially Roose Bolton, from what I've heard. Rushing in blindly would be a mistake." They spent hours crafting a carefully worded reply, using a rudimentary cipher. Sansa wrote it in her neat script. "To our friends in the north. We hear your call. House Stark remembers its duty to the north, and we will not abandon those who resist the flayed man. Yet we must proceed with wisdom. The Vale has only recently found its footing. We promise to prepare knights, to form an alliance in secret, and to support a rising when the hour is best chosen. Tell us more of the houses that stand with you, and how prepared they are to move. Let us coordinate. When the time is ripe, the wolves shall return." Sansa Stark, daughter of House Stark, with support from the Vale. She sealed it, making certain the wax was unmarked. The letter would travel discreetly, carried by trusted men who took winding routes. She did not trust ravens for such delicate matters, given how many maesters might report to the Boltons or to King's Landing. When the letter was dispatched, Sansa felt a curious mixture of nerves and hope. She had taken a step beyond talk. She had effectively begun an alliance with northern rebels. There was no turning back. She hoped she had not condemned them or the Vale to ruin if the plan failed. But a whisper in her heart told her it was right. The Boltons must not remain in Winterfell. Meanwhile, life in the Vale continued. Robert Arryn oversaw small ceremonies, awarding minor titles to knights who had fought bravely against the mountain clans. Sansa stood by, urging him to speak clearly, to appear lordly. He did his best, though he still trembled at times. The Vale lords expressed satisfaction that their lands were more secure. House Grafton wrote to Sansa, proposing expansions in trade with the free cities. She answered politely, seeing potential for increased prosperity. Slowly, methodically, she guided the Vale toward stability. Yet each night, before she slept, Sansa would think of the north, of the letter she had sent, of the battered holdfasts still flying the direwolf in secret, of the winter snows that would soon blanket those fields. She would see, in her mind's eye, the halls of Winterfell warmed by torchlight, the heart tree standing silent in the godswood. She remembered how the wind once rustled the red leaves overhead, how the courtyard smelled of smoke and pine. That was home. She would not rest until it was free. Weeks slipped by, the air turning colder, the days shorter. Winter was not fully upon them, but the warnings were there. The Vale's high passes grew dangerous with ice, yet the lowlands remained passable. Lord Royce completed his campaigns, establishing a network of watchtowers manned by loyal knights. House Waynwood prepared stockpiles for a possible winter push. The seeds of readiness were sown, even if few recognized the deeper reason behind it. They believed they were simply ensuring the Vale's readiness for any trouble. Only Sansa, Lady Waynwood, and Lord Royce knew the true extent of her plans for the north. At last, another secret letter arrived, delivered by the same method as before. Sansa's hands shook slightly as she read it in her solar with Lady Waynwood standing by. The words were more direct this time. Lady Stark, we have conferred with those who share our cause. House Manderly, certain loyal Umbers, even some within House Glover, stand ready to rise if given hope of southern aid. The Boltons fear an outside force they cannot predict, so they cling to Winterfell's ruins and keep their forces spread thin to quell dissent. If you pledge a contingent of knights from the Vale to strike swiftly, we believe we can rally the north. The flayed man will fall, and the dire wolf shall rise. We await your final word. Winter is near. We cannot hold back forever. A friend in the north. Sansa's heart hammered. This was the commitment they sought. A real alliance. A plan to strike at the Boltons with the combined might of northern rebels and Vale knights. Lady Waynwood read the letter too, her face grave. If we do this, we march into a war. We risk the Vale's men, many of whom do not fully understand your cause. Some might object unless Robert Arryn publicly endorses it. But Robert is not strong, nor does he have the will for such an undertaking. Sansa pressed her lips together. Robert wants to remain neutral, or so we believed. But perhaps I can persuade him that freeing Winterfell is in the Vale's interest. After all, if the Boltons consolidate the north, they could eventually threaten us. And House Arryn was always close to House Stark. If I present it as restoring an old alliance, perhaps he will allow it. Lady Waynwood gave her a sympathetic look. Try, child, but do not break him with persuasion. He is fragile. Sansa nodded. Her stomach knotted with tension. She imagined Robert's face. He would balk at the idea of war. Yet she had managed to coax him out of other fears. Could she coax him into supporting an offensive? If not, she might have to gather allies more discreetly. But that would be perilous, risking open rebellion within the Vale if discovered. She composed herself. I will speak to him, she said. We must do this with at least his tacit blessing. Then we can move quickly. The northern rebels need a sign of commitment soon, or they may lose heart. That evening, she found Robert in the solar, where he was picking at a tray of sweet biscuits. He looked up, smiling nervously when she arrived. Sansa, do you want a biscuit? They're lemon-flavored. She forced a light laugh. Thank you, Robert, but not right now. She lowered herself into a chair beside him, letting the warm glow of the fireplace wash over them. I wish to speak with you about something important. His face fell immediately into worry. Is something wrong? She softened her tone, clasping her hands. No, not wrong, but a matter of the future. You know that I am from the north, that my family once ruled Winterfell. I have news that the Boltons, who hold Winterfell now, are greatly disliked by many northerners. They want a Stark to return to free them from Bolton rule. Some are asking me to help. Robert's eyes widened. You mean, you want to fight them? In time, yes. The Boltons are cruel, Robert. They're known for flaying their enemies. They had a hand in the terrible Red Wedding, where my mother and brother were killed. She swallowed, her voice tight with memory. If they remain in power, they could become a threat to the Vale eventually. We have a chance to stop them now, help the North restore peace. But it would require some knights from the Vale, at least enough to bolster the Northern Rebellion. Robert squirmed in his chair, dropping the biscuit. War? I don't like war. People die, and I'd have to send my knights away? What if the mountain clans come back? Sansa maintained a calm, soothing demeanor. Lord Royce has secured the passes. The clans are weakened, and it wouldn't be the entire Vale's force, just a portion, enough to show we stand with the North. Think of it as the Vale renewing its old bond with my father's house. She leaned forward, catching his gaze. "Robert, we have a chance to do something honorable, just as your father, Jon Arryn, did when he rose against the Mad King. The Vale has always been the land of honor. This is our chance to prove it again." He fidgeted, tears brimming in his eyes. "But I'm scared. I don't want to be like my mother, who—" He trailed off, remembering how Lysa Arryn had died. What if something goes wrong? She reached for his hand gently. "I understand your fears. Nothing is guaranteed. But we will be careful, gather intelligence. I won't lead you into danger blindly, I promise. You can remain here, safe in Ironokes, or wherever you choose. I will oversee the knights, along with Lady Waynwood and Lord Royce, if they agree. We'll protect you, Robert, as your mother once wanted." He gazed at her, fear warring with a flicker of admiration. "And if we don't go? The Boltons? They might hurt more people, right?" She nodded solemnly. "They already have. The North suffers under them. If we act now, we might save countless lives." He turned his head, staring at the fire. For long minutes he said nothing, only chewed his lip. Sansa waited, heart pounding. She knew how delicate this was. If he flatly refused, she might have to defy him, risking fracturing the Vale's unity. At last he inhaled a shaky breath. If you really think it's best, I guess I can allow some knights to go. But promise me you won't let them kill me if we lose." Sansa's chest tightened in compassion. "No one will harm you, cousin. You have my word." He gave a small nod, tears shining in his eyes. Then do what you must. But be careful, Sansa. I don't want you to die either." She squeezed his hand gently. "I'll be careful. Thank you, Robert." She left him in the solar, her heart in tumult. She had his tentative blessing, but the weight of it pressed on her shoulders. She found Lady Waynwood waiting just beyond the doorway, and she nodded once, quietly. "He'll allow it," she said in a hushed voice. Lady Waynwood exhaled in relief. "That's one hurdle cleared. Now we must speak with Lord Royce and gather our knights discreetly. Winter is close. If we wait too long, the mountain passes will be impassable." Thus began a new flurry of preparations. Sansa, Lady Waynwood, and Lord Royce held private councils, deciding how many knights they could spare for the northern campaign without leaving the Vale vulnerable. They wrote to the unnamed northern correspondents, informing them of the Vale's readiness to assist, requesting final details of how and when to strike. The plan was risky. They would attempt to time their march so as to arrive in the north when the loyal houses rose against the Boltons, ideally capturing them in a pincer. Yet the specter of winter loomed. The roads might become choked with snow, the supply lines precarious. Sansa considered every caution, recalling old stories of the harsh northern winters. But if they delayed until spring, the Boltons might have crushed all rebellion. It was a gamble, and so, on a cold morning when a light snow dusted Ironokes' courtyard, Sansa stood beside Lord Royce as the chosen knights assembled. There were 300 men in total, mostly heavy cavalry and a handful of foot soldiers. Lady Waynwood contributed 50 of her best, while other houses sent smaller contingents. All in all, it was not a vast host, but it was a formidable strike force, swift and disciplined, enough to bolster the north if the rebels were numerous. They would travel east then north, skirting the edges of the Bloody Gate and crossing the narrow path that would take them through the eastern frontier of the Neck. It was a dangerous route, but quieter than passing too close to Moat Cailin, which was rumored to be under Bolton watch. Sansa planned to accompany them. She could not remain behind, not if she was to rally the northern houses as Sansa Stark. Robert, though anxious, agreed to let her go, staying in Ironokes with Lady Waynwood to protect him. On the day of departure, Sansa dressed in warm riding leathers beneath a thick cloak, a far cry from the gowns she had once worn. At her hip she wore a small dagger. She was no warrior, but she would not be entirely defenseless. Lord Royce wore his heavy bronze armor, as unyielding as stone. Maya Stone joined them as well, eager to see the north. The assembled knights hoisted banners not of House Arryn, but plain white flags, so as not to draw attention. Officially, they traveled as a patrol safeguarding eastern routes, or so said the story. In reality, they aimed to slip quietly toward White Harbor territory and join with the northern rebels in secret. Sansa paused to bid Lady Waynwood farewell, clasping her hands. "If I do not return quickly, or if word of disaster comes, keep Robert safe. Please." The older woman's eyes were sad but resolute. "I will protect him with my life, and I will pray for your success, child." She squeezed Sansa's hands. "Go free your home." Emotion swelled in Sansa's chest. She nodded, turning to mount her horse, an even-tempered gray mare chosen for long travel. Lord Royce took point, leading the column out of Ironokes. Sansa rode near the front, her cloak billowing behind her in the chilly breeze. Servants, guards, and Robert himself stood in the courtyard, watching them depart. The boy lifted a trembling hand in farewell. Sansa forced a brave smile, praying she had not led them all into doom. They rode away from Ironokes, snow crunching under the horses' hooves. Trees stood bare, the sky leaden. The path wound through low hills, then veered toward the mountain's flank. This was only the first leg of a journey that might end in bloodshed, or in triumph, if the gods were kind. Sansa set her jaw, reminding herself that she had chosen this path, that she was no longer a frightened bird in a cage. She was Sansa Stark, riding with Knights of the Vale to reclaim her birthright. As the column stretched out along the road, she glanced back once more at the silhouette of Ironokes against the winter horizon. In that moment, she felt a surge of resolve. Let the Boltons tremble. The old ties between the Vale and the North were being rekindled. House Stark would not stay shattered forever. She turned forward again, urging her mare on. The wind caught her hair, stinging her cheeks with cold, but she did not flinch. She had faced worse. She would face whatever came next with the courage of a wolf. And so they rode toward the north, uncertain but unbowed, the memory of Ned Stark's honor guiding her steps, the faint hope of a free Winterfell lighting her path. The Vale had been claimed. Now it was time to see if Sansa Stark could reclaim her home.